Welcome back, dear traveller. Find a comfortable place to rest your body. Let your limbs grow heavy. Let your breathing slow just a little. You do not need to hold on to anything right now. The world outside can wait. Tonight, we're going somewhere very far away. Not across an ocean or over a mountain range, but backward through time itself. Deep into the story of this Earth, your Earth, before any footprint was ever pressed into mud, before any roar echoed across a valley, before the very first creature lifted its face toward a younger sun. We want to thank you for supporting us, and it would mean so much if you could support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing to help us keep this channel going. Anyways, back to the video. Tonight's journey begins not with the dinosaurs you may know and love, but with everything that came before them. The ancient seas, the first breath of oxygen rising through a primordial sky. The long, quiet eons of a world learning how to be alive. So close your eyes if you wish. Let the words wash over you like warm water. We have billions of years to explore together, and there is no hurry at all. Let us begin at the very beginning. Picture the solar system as it was 4.5 billion years ago. There were no planets yet. There was no Earth, no moon, no familiar blue marble floating in the quiet dark. There was only a vast, spinning cloud of gas and dust, ancient debris left over from the death of older stars. Particles of rock and ice and metal drifted through the void in slow, lazy spirals, gradually pulling toward one another under the patient influence of gravity. At the centre of this cloud, something extraordinary was happening. A knot of gas was collapsing inward, growing hotter and denser with every passing million years. Hydrogen atoms were being crushed together so tightly that they began to fuse, releasing light and heat and energy in quantities almost beyond comprehension. This was the birth of your sun, a middling, ordinary star, remarkable only in that it happened to exist in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to allow what came next. Around this newborn star, the remaining cloud of dust and gas began to flatten into a disk. Within that disk, particles collided and stuck together. Small clumps became larger clumps became boulders became planetesimals, rocky bodies perhaps a kilometre or several across, tumbling through the infant solar system in vast overlapping orbits. And from those planetesimals the planets were born. The process was not gentle, it was not quiet. It was a time of almost incomprehensible violence, collisions and mergers happening continuously over millions of years, objects the size of mountains slamming into objects the size of continents, releasing energy that melted everything they touched. The early Earth was not a rocky, stable world. It was a seething ball of molten rock, an ocean of magma stretching from pole to pole, glowing red and orange and white against the darkness of space. This earliest phase of Earth's history is called the Hadean Aeon, named, quite aptly, for the ancient Greek underworld, because the early Earth, if you could somehow have stood upon it, would have seemed like a kind of hell. The temperatures were extraordinary, thousands of degrees at the surface. The sky was not blue, but a deep sulphurous orange-red, thick with water vapour and carbon dioxide and nitrogen and poisonous gases that had been outgassed from the molten rock below. There was no solid ground, there was no ocean, there was no air that any living thing could breathe. There was only fire and rock and the slow, grinding work of gravity pulling everything together. And yet, even here, in this most hostile of worlds, the story of life was already being quietly written. Let your thoughts drift with the heat haze rising from that ancient surface. Imagine the glow of it, orange and deep red stretching to every horizon. There is something almost hypnotic about the thought of it, this world in its infancy, still learning what it wanted to be. About 100 million years after Earth's formation, something extraordinary happened. A body roughly the size of Mars, which scientists have named Theia, was drifting through the early solar system on a collision course with the young Earth. We do not know exactly how this object came to be on that path. Perhaps it was nudged by the gravity of Jupiter. Perhaps it was simply the chaotic nature of a solar system still sorting itself out. What we know is that Theia struck the Earth. The impact was not a glancing blow or a near miss. It was a direct, catastrophic collision, one of the largest single events in this planet's entire history. The force of it was staggering. Both bodies were largely vaporized by the impact. Much of Thayer's iron core sank into the young Earth, adding to our planet's own core. But an enormous cloud of vaporized rock was flung outward into orbit around the Earth, a ring of debris that slowly, over thousands of years, coalesced under gravity into a new body. The Moon. This is the leading theory for the origin of your Moon, and it explains a remarkable number of things. Why the Moon's composition is so similar to Earth's outer layers, why it has so little iron, why it is so large relative to its parent planet. The Moon is, in a very real sense, a piece of the Earth itself, torn away in a moment of cosmic violence and reshaped in orbit. In the aftermath of the impact, Earth was once again a molten world, but now it had a companion, a massive glowing satellite hanging low and enormous in the sky, so close that it appeared perhaps 20 times larger than it does today. The tidal forces it exerted on the young Earth were enormous, generating friction and heat deep in our planet's interior that kept it warm and geologically active. As the millions of years passed, the surface of the Earth began, slowly and intermittently, to cool. The lightest elements floated upward through the magma. Gases escaped from the cooling rock and began to form a primitive atmosphere. And from space, from the outer regions of the solar system where icy comets and rocky asteroids were still plentiful, a constant rain of objects continued to fall onto the young Earth. This period, known as the Late Heavy Bombardment, lasted perhaps from about 4 billion years ago to around 3.5 billion years ago. For hundreds of millions of years, the Earth was struck again and again and again by massive objects from space. Craters formed and were erased by the continuing activity of the surface. The skies were lit with the trails of incoming objects. But those incoming objects brought something important. They brought water. Much of Earth's water, the water that fills your oceans today, the water in the clouds above you, the water in your body, may have arrived in those icy comets and asteroids that bombarded the early Earth. There is considerable scientific debate about exactly how much water was delivered this way versus how much was already here, outgassed from the interior of the planet. But what is clear is that as the Earth cooled, as the bombardment gradually lessened, water began to accumulate on the surface. The first ocean was born. Not all at once, not with a great dramatic rush, but slowly, over millions of years, as the surface temperature dropped below the boiling point of water, as steam condensed from the thick early atmosphere into droplets, as those droplets fell as rain onto a still hot surface, as shallow pools gathered in low places, as those pools connected and deepened, the ocean came into being. And with the ocean, everything changed. Picture the surface of the Earth perhaps 4 billion years ago. The crust had solidified, at least in patches. There were low-lying basins filled with shallow, warm water, water that was not clear and blue like the ocean you might picture, but murky and mineral-rich, tinged perhaps with orange or green or brown from dissolved compounds. The sky above was thick and hazy, filtering the young sun's light into something dimmer and redder than you're used to. No moon yet hung large in the sky. The moon had retreated somewhat from its original closeness, though it was still dramatically larger in appearance than today. This was a world completely without life, not merely without advanced life or complex life, but utterly and completely lifeless, as far as we know, not a single cell, not a molecule capable of copying itself, not even the most primitive stirring of organic chemistry. And yet somewhere in those warm and mineral-rich waters, among the hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, or in tidal pools along rocky shores, or in some other setting we have not yet fully identified, something was about to happen. Something was about to try for the very first time to be alive. Let that thought settle over you gently as you rest. The vast, dark ocean of an early Earth, waiting in the warm silence for the first breath of life. There is something extraordinarily peaceful about imagining it. All that patient, mineral-rich water, all those billions of years stretching out ahead. No rush, no urgency, just the slow, inevitable unfolding of a story that ends, billions of years later, with you here, listening to these words. The world was ready, it just needed a spark. The solar nebula from which our sun and planets formed was itself the product of an older story, a story of stellar death. The cloud of gas and dust that eventually became our solar system contained material forged in the cores of earlier stars, stars that had lived out their lives over millions or billions of years before exploding as supernovae, scattering their enriched contents into the surrounding space, the iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, the oxygen you breathe. All of these elements were manufactured in the nuclear furnaces of stars that no longer exist, scattered into the cosmos, gathered up again by gravity, and eventually incorporated into the rocky body of a new world. This is not poetry. This is physics and chemistry and the long arithmetic of cosmic time. Every atom in your body has a history stretching back long before the Earth existed, back to the burning cores of ancient vanished stars. You are, in a very literal sense, made of stardust. The disk of material that surrounded the young sun was not uniform. Closer to the sun, where temperatures were high, only materials with high melting points could survive in solid form, metals and silicates, the stuff of rocky planets. Farther out, where temperatures dropped below the freezing point of water, ice could persist, and the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, gathered enormous quantities of icy material along with their gas. The inner rocky planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, formed in the hot inner region of the disk, built primarily of metals and rock. They grew through a process called accretion, small particles sticking together electrostatically to form larger particles, which clumped together into pebble-sized objects, which collided to form boulder-sized objects, which merged into kilometre-sized planetesimals, which grew through mutual gravitational attraction into the embryos of planets. The process was not orderly or sequential. At any given moment, thousands of planetesimals were orbiting the young sun on overlapping paths, and collisions were frequent and violent. Each collision released heat, the kinetic energy of two massive objects slamming together at high speed. And because the Earth was growing through an almost continuous series of such collisions, it was almost continuously generating heat. The heat had nowhere to go. It accumulated. The early Earth was a magma ocean. The term magma ocean is one that scientists use carefully because it does not necessarily mean that the entire planet was uniformly molten. More likely, the magma ocean was a complex system, perhaps entirely molten in the upper hundreds of kilometres, transitioning to partially molten or solid material at depth, with the deepest interior perhaps solid under the enormous pressure. But the surface was certainly molten, and the environment was utterly hostile to anything we would recognise as life. As the magma ocean cooled, differentiation occurred. The heaviest elements, primarily iron and nickel, sank toward the centre of the planet, forming the core. The lighter elements, silicates and aluminosilicates, floated upward, forming what would eventually become the mantle and crust. This process of differentiation released enormous amounts of gravitational energy, further heating the interior. The heat from differentiation, combined with the heat from continuing impacts and the heat from the decay of radioactive elements incorporated into the early Earth, kept the planet's interior warm for billions of years. It keeps it warm today. The heat that drives the volcanoes and earthquakes and the movement of tectonic plates, the heat that has been shaping the surface of the Earth throughout its history, is largely this primordial heat, plus the ongoing contribution of radioactive decay. The collision that formed the Moon, the Great Impact of Theia, occurred when the Earth was perhaps 50 to 100 million years old, still in the thick of the accretion process but perhaps with a partially solidified surface. The impact reset much of the thermal clock, melting the surface once again and flinging an enormous mass of material into orbit. The formation of the Moon is one of the most studied problems in planetary science, and yet significant uncertainties remain. The giant impact hypothesis explains many features of the Moon beautifully: its size, its orbit, its composition, but it also raises puzzles. The Moon is almost identical in isotopic composition to the Earth's mantle, when most models of the Theia impact predict that the Moon should contain a significant fraction of Theia's material, which would presumably have a different isotopic signature. Explaining this similarity requires either that Theia and the young Earth had very similar compositions, which seems unlikely, or that the material that formed the Moon was thoroughly mixed after the impact in ways that current models do not fully capture. What is not in doubt is that the Moon is there, and that it has profoundly shaped the Earth ever since its formation. The Moon's gravitational pull stabilizes the tilt of Earth's rotational axis, keeping it from wobbling chaotically over time, a stabilization that has likely contributed to the relative climate stability that allowed complex life to evolve and persist. The tidal forces from the moon and from the sun drive the tides that have shaped coastlines and influenced the evolution of animals at the water's edge for hundreds of millions of years. The moon has been slowing the Earth's rotation through tidal friction since its formation. The early Earth rotated much faster, perhaps completing a day in 6 hours, a pace that would have driven fierce, constant winds across the surface. In the immediate aftermath of the moon-forming impact, the debris disk in orbit around the Earth coalesced into the moon over a period estimated at perhaps a few thousand years, fast in geological terms. The newly formed moon was much closer to the Earth than it is today, perhaps only about a quarter of its current distance. From the Earth's surface, if it had had a surface one could stand on, which it did not, the moon would have been enormous and brilliant, its face glowing orange-red with the heat of its own recent formation. And the tides that moon generated would have been extraordinary, not the gentle twice-daily rise and fall you know, but enormous oscillations driven by the immense tidal forces of a nearby moon acting on a rapidly spinning planet. The magma ocean of the early Earth would have experienced tidal heating on a scale that's hard to imagine, the crust flexing and deforming under forces that keep the moon Io in orbit around Jupiter, perpetually volcanically active to this day. Gradually, over hundreds of millions of years, the surface of the early Earth cooled. As the magma ocean froze from the bottom up, driven by the higher pressure at depth, a thin crust began to form at the surface. This earliest crust was not the stable, thick crust of the modern world. It was thin, easily fractured, constantly being disrupted by continuing impacts and by the volcanic activity of the hot mantle below. The record of this earliest crust is almost entirely erased. The oldest intact rocks on Earth are dated to about 4 billion years ago. Ancient, extraordinary survivors of a world that has otherwise been entirely recycled. One of the most important things that happened during the Hadean was the development of plate tectonics. The question of when plate tectonics began on Earth is one of the great unresolved questions in geoscience. Some evidence suggests it had begun by at least 4 billion years ago. Other interpretations suggest it may not have fully established itself until much later, perhaps 2 or 3 billion years ago. The answer matters enormously, because plate tectonics is not merely a geological curiosity. It is a fundamental feature of the Earth that has shaped everything about the planet. Its climate, its ocean chemistry, its volcanic activity, and arguably, the conditions that allowed life to arise and persist. Plate tectonics is a cycle. Rocks are created at mid-ocean ridges, where plates pull apart and new seafloor wells up from below. Those rocks spread outward from the ridge, cool, and eventually reach a subduction zone, where one plate dips beneath another. As the subducting plate descends into the mantle, it carries with it water and carbon dioxide and other volatiles that were incorporated into the rocks at the surface. This material is eventually returned to the atmosphere through volcanic activity at the surface, a cycle of carbon and other elements that has regulated the Earth's climate for billions of years. Without plate tectonics, the Earth would look very different. The carbon cycle that regulates atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, and therefore the Earth's greenhouse effect and climate, depends critically on the ability of the crust to recycle. Without it, carbon dioxide might accumulate in the atmosphere, causing runaway warming, or might be removed entirely by weathering without being returned, causing runaway cooling. Either way, the stable, livable planet we inhabit would likely not exist. And without the stable, livable planet, the rest of the story does not happen. So as you picture the Hadean Earth, try to hold two things at once. On the surface, a world of fire and rock and molten devastation, hostile beyond anything in human experience, the very opposite of the soft, green, oxygen-rich world you know. And beneath that surface, the slow, grinding, inexorable machinery of a planet learning to regulate itself, building the systems of heat and chemistry and geological cycling that would, given enough time, create the conditions for everything else. The world was learning how to be a world, and it was learning in fire. No one knows exactly how life began on Earth. This is one of the most profound and humbling statements in all of science. After centuries of investigation, after extraordinary advances in chemistry and biology and geology and astronomy, after the decoding of entire genomes and the mapping of molecular pathways of almost unimaginable complexity, we still do not know precisely how the first living cell came into being on this planet. What we do know is that it happened, and we know from the evidence preserved in the oldest rocks on Earth that it happened surprisingly quickly, relatively speaking, after the conditions that allowed life became possible. The oldest confirmed evidence of life on Earth comes from rocks in Western Australia, dated to approximately 3.5 billion years ago. In these rocks, which were once shallow seafloor sediments, scientists have found structures called stromatolites, layered mats formed by communities of ancient microorganisms. These stromatolites are not merely chemical curiosities. They were built by living things, by cells that consumed sunlight and produced waste products and grew and divided, by cells that were, in every meaningful sense, alive. 3.5 billion years ago, when the Earth itself was only about 1 billion years old. But the story of life's origin goes back even further than the oldest fossils we've found, because fossils preserve only the hard parts, only the things that happen to be in the right place to be buried and transformed over time. The very first cells left no fossils at all. They were too small, too soft, too fragile. What they left instead were chemical signatures, subtle ratios of carbon isotopes in ancient rocks that suggest the presence of biological processes, molecular traces of organic compounds that could only have been produced by life. These chemical whispers push the origin of life back perhaps to 3.8 billion years ago, or even earlier, into the very heart of the Hadean bombardment itself. And this raises a remarkable possibility. Could life have originated, been destroyed by a massive asteroid impact and then re-originated? Could the earliest living things have survived by sheltering in deep ocean vents or far below the surface, only to emerge again when conditions improved? Scientists call these potential early survivors the ancestors of life, or, more poetically, the survivors of the bombardment. But let us set aside the uncertainty for a moment and explore what is known about the chemistry of life's origin. The building blocks of life, the organic molecules from which all living things are constructed, are surprisingly easy to make. In a famous experiment conducted in the 1950s, a scientist named Stanley Miller and his mentor Harold Urey sealed water, methane, ammonia and hydrogen in a glass container, simulating the early Earth's ocean and atmosphere, and passed electric sparks through it to simulate lightning. After just a week, they found that the water had become rich with amino acids, the molecular building blocks of proteins. Life's ingredients, it turned out, formed spontaneously under conditions that existed on the early Earth. They also form in space. Amino acids and other organic compounds have been found in meteorites, in comets, even drifting in interstellar clouds. The universe, it seems, has a strong tendency to produce the raw materials of life wherever the conditions are even remotely right. But raw materials are not life. A pile of bricks is not a house. The leap from amino acids and simple organic molecules to a living cell, a cell capable of reproducing itself, of maintaining its internal chemistry, of responding to its environment, that leap is the mystery. The most widely accepted idea today involves a molecule called RNA. RNA is a cousin of DNA, the molecule that carries genetic information in your cells. Unlike DNA, RNA can do two things that DNA cannot. It can store information, like DNA, but it can also catalyze chemical reactions, like proteins. This dual ability makes RNA a plausible candidate for the first self-replicating molecule, something that could both carry the instructions for its own reproduction and carry out those instructions. In this hypothesis, called the RNA world, the first step toward life was the formation of RNA molecules in some sheltered environment, perhaps a shallow pool that dried up periodically, concentrating chemicals, or perhaps a hydrothermal vent on the ocean floor, where the chemical gradients between hot mineral-rich water and cooler seawater could have driven chemical reactions. Over time, by pure chance, some RNA molecules acquired the ability to copy themselves. Those that copied themselves more efficiently outcompeted those that did not. The principle of natural selection, evolution, began operating on chemistry long before the first true cell ever formed. Eventually, these early RNA molecules became enclosed within lipid membranes, thin, flexible bubbles of fatty acids that form spontaneously in water, and the earliest protocells were born. Picture this ancient chemistry happening in the warm, shallow seas of a world utterly unlike your own. No wind carries the smell of salt to a shore. No seabirds call overhead. No fish move through the water. There is only the quiet lapping of mineral-rich water against rocks that have never known a footstep. And somewhere deep in that water, in places you could not even see with the naked eye, the most important chemistry in the history of the planet is taking place. Life is beginning. The eon in which life first appeared and spent its earliest billions of years is called the Archean, from the Greek word for ancient. It lasted from roughly 4 billion years ago to 2.5 billion years ago, a span of time almost incomprehensibly long. The Archean Earth was profoundly alien by modern standards. The atmosphere contained almost no oxygen. This is deeply counterintuitive to us, because we tend to think of oxygen as essential for life, and so it is for us and for most complex living things. But the first forms of life on Earth were anaerobes. They did not breathe oxygen. In fact, for the earliest life, oxygen was a poison. The sky of the Archean Earth, if you could have stood on its surface, would have been orange-red or perhaps greenish, tinged by the methane in the atmosphere. The sun, still somewhat cooler and dimmer than today, cast a weaker light. And yet, paradoxically, the surface may have been warmer than today, kept warm by the high concentrations of greenhouse gases in the thick early atmosphere. The ocean of the Archean was also deeply different. It was likely warm, perhaps much warmer than today's oceans, with average temperatures in some regions exceeding 50 or 60 degrees Celsius, water that would feel nearly hot to modern human touch. It was also rich with dissolved iron, coloured perhaps a rusty brown-red rather than the blue-green we associate with the sea. The crust of the early Earth was thinner and hotter than it is today, and volcanic activity was far more intense. Enormous volcanic structures called greenstone belts, now recognisable only as ancient twisted rock formations in places like Canada and Australia and southern Africa, were forming all across the surface. Hot springs and hydrothermal vents were ubiquitous, pouring mineral-rich fluids into the surrounding ocean. And in these waters, life was already doing something extraordinary. It was diversifying. The earliest life forms were single-celled organisms, microbes not unlike modern bacteria in their basic architecture. They had no nucleus, no membrane-bound internal structures. Their DNA floated freely in the interior of the cell. We call such cells prokaryotes, and they remain, to this day, the most abundant life forms on Earth. But even in those early billions of years, prokaryotic life was experimenting with different ways of obtaining energy. Some early organisms fed on the organic chemicals dissolved in the warm water around them. Others evolved to use chemical energy, to extract usable energy from reactions between compounds like hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide. These chemolithotrophs, as they are called, still exist today, living in the extreme environments of hydrothermal vents. And then, perhaps 3.5 billion years ago, though the exact date remains a subject of research, one lineage of microbe made a discovery that would, over the course of the next 2 billion years, utterly transform this planet. It learned to harvest energy from sunlight. This process, which we call photosynthesis, seems simple in its broad outline. Use the energy of light to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. But in terms of its consequences for the history of life on Earth, photosynthesis ranks among the most important innovations in the entire history of biology. The first photosynthetic organisms were not the green plants you are familiar with. They were cyanobacteria, single-celled prokaryotes, microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, forming thin films and mats in the shallow sunlit waters of the Archean seas. They were not impressive to look at. They left behind only those layered structures, stromatolites, as evidence of their existence. But they were pumping oxygen into an atmosphere that had almost none. At first, the oxygen they produced was quickly absorbed by the dissolved iron in the ocean, oxidizing it and causing it to precipitate out of the water as iron oxide, rust. This is why the world's great iron ore deposits, the banded iron formations that humans mine today for steel production, are so old. They were laid down during this period as the oceans rusted. For hundreds of millions of years, the oxygen produced by cyanobacteria was being consumed almost as fast as it was being produced. But eventually the iron ran out. The ocean became saturated, the oxygen began to accumulate. And the world was about to change in a way it had never changed before. Let your breathing slow as you contemplate this. All of that quiet time, billions of years of microscopic life working away in the warm seas, invisible and unheralded, slowly and irresistibly transforming the chemistry of a whole planet. There is something deeply soothing in the thought of it. All that patient, invisible work adding up to something enormous over time. The world does not rush. It does not hurry. It simply continues, breath by breath, year by year, until everything is different. And in the quiet of those ancient seas, everything was about to become very different indeed. The question of how the first cell membrane formed is almost as difficult as the question of how RNA first replicated itself. Cell membranes are made of lipids, fat-like molecules that have a remarkable property. They spontaneously form double-layered sheets, and those sheets spontaneously curve into closed spheres. Put lipids in water, and they form vesicles, small hollow spheres bounded by a lipid bilayer. This happens without any biological machinery, without any instruction from DNA or RNA. It is simply what lipids do in water. This means that the first cell-like structures, the first protocells, may have arisen simply from the spontaneous self-assembly of lipids and RNA in warm water. The RNA would have been enclosed within the lipid vesicle, protected from the surrounding environment, with the vesicle's membrane allowing small molecules to pass through while retaining the larger RNA molecules inside. The protocell could grow as lipids from the surrounding water were incorporated into its membrane, and it could divide, not by any controlled process, but simply because physical forces would cause a large enough vesicle to become unstable and pinch off into two smaller ones. And if the RNA inside the protocell were capable of replicating itself, then when the protocell divided, copies of the RNA would be distributed to the daughter cells. Some daughter cells would have more efficient RNA replicators. Those cells would grow faster, divide more often. Natural selection would begin to favour the more efficient over the less efficient. Evolution, in its most primitive form, would have begun. This scenario, or something like it, is the most coherent picture we currently have of the origin of life. It is not a complete picture. There are enormous gaps, enormous uncertainties. The chemistry is extraordinarily complex, and demonstrating in the laboratory that all of these steps can occur spontaneously and in sequence remains an ongoing research challenge. But the broad outline, chemistry, self-replication, membranes, selection, is compelling. Once the first cells existed, evolution did the rest. And evolution, given enough time and the right raw materials, is extraordinarily powerful. The Archean world in which the first life evolved and diversified was a world we can partially reconstruct from the rocks that survive from that time. The oldest rocks on Earth are found in a handful of places. The Nouveau-Guétuc greenstone belt in Quebec, possibly dated as far back as 4 billion years ago. The Acasta gneiss in Canada's Northwest Territories, dated at 3.96 billion years. Rocks in Greenland and Australia and southern Africa that date back 3.5 to 4 billion years. These ancient rocks are extraordinary survivors. Most of the early crust has been recycled into the mantle through subduction and remelting. What we have are fragments. But those fragments tell a story. They tell us that liquid water was present on the Earth's surface early, perhaps earlier than 4 billion years ago. Tiny crystals of the mineral zircon, found embedded in younger rocks in Australia, contain chemical signatures suggesting they formed in the presence of water at temperatures below the boiling point. And they have been dated to 4.4 billion years ago. This pushes the evidence for liquid water back almost to the formation of the Earth itself, into the heart of the Hadean. The early ocean was different from the modern ocean in important ways. Its chemistry was different, richer in certain dissolved metals, particularly iron, because the lack of oxygen meant that iron could remain dissolved in water rather than rusting out. Its temperature was probably higher, though exactly how much higher is debated. Some models suggest the Archean Ocean was very warm, perhaps 50 or 60 degrees Celsius on average, while others suggest temperatures closer to modern values. The ocean was also less salty, or possibly more salty, depending on which models you trust. The salinity of the modern ocean is maintained by a balance between inputs from rivers and hydrothermal vents, and outputs through evaporation, the formation of certain minerals and subduction of oceanic crust. In the Archean, these fluxes were different, and the salinity balance would have been different too. The seafloor of the Archean was dominated by hydrothermal vent systems, places where seawater percolated down through cracks in the oceanic crust, was heated by the hot rock below, dissolved minerals from the rock, and then emerged back into the ocean through vent chimneys. Modern hydrothermal vents, particularly the black smokers of the mid-ocean ridges, are among the most biologically rich environments on Earth, hosting communities of bacteria and archaea and larger animals that live entirely independently of sunlight, powered by the chemical energy of the venting fluids. The Archean vents would have been similar, though perhaps more numerous and more vigorous, and around those vents the first communities of life were building. The diversity of early microbial life is something that the fossil record cannot tell us much about. Soft-bodied single-celled organisms decay without trace under most circumstances, and the ancient rocks that might have preserved them have been so severely altered by heat and pressure over billions of years that even chemical signatures are often ambiguous. What we can infer comes from two sources: the few fossil structures we do find, like the stromatolites, and the record preserved in the genomes of modern organisms. Genomics has become a powerful tool for understanding the deep history of life. By comparing the DNA sequences of modern organisms, bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, scientists can reconstruct the evolutionary relationships between them and, with various assumptions, estimate when different lineages diverged. This molecular clock approach has its limitations and uncertainties, but the broad patterns it reveals are illuminating. The deepest split in the tree of life is between the bacteria on one side and the archaea and eukaryotes on the other. Bacteria and archaea look similar under a microscope. Both are single-celled prokaryotes, but at the molecular level, they are profoundly different. Their cell membranes are made of different types of lipid. Their ribosomes, the molecular machines that synthesize proteins, are different. Their methods of replicating DNA are different. The two domains are separated by billions of years of independent evolution. The archaea are, in some ways, the more extreme of the two domains. Modern archaea are found in some of the most hostile environments on Earth: boiling hot springs, acidic volcanic pools, hypersaline lakes, the oxygen-free depths of the ocean. Their ability to survive in these extreme conditions reflects their ancient origins. These environments are in many ways more similar to the Archean Earth than the gentle, oxygenated, temperate environments that most life prefers today. The third domain of life, the eukaryotes, the domain that includes you, is, as we touched on earlier, a hybrid. Eukaryotic cells contain features that originated in bacteria, features that originated in archaea, and features that appear to be unique to eukaryotes. The leading model is that eukaryotes arose from an intimate partnership between an archaeal cell and one or more bacterial cells, an endosymbiosis that occurred perhaps 1.5 to 2 billion years ago in the Proterozoic seas. But before the eukaryotes, there was just the Archean world of bacteria and archaea, diversifying in the warm, mineral-rich ocean, and it was those early microbes that began the transformation of the planet, a transformation that, over the course of the next 2 billion years, would completely and irreversibly change the chemistry of the atmosphere and ocean, and set the stage for everything that came after. The stromatolites are the most tangible record of this early microbial world. Modern stromatolites still grow in a few places, most famously in Shark Bay in Western Australia, where the shallow, hypersaline water inhibits the grazing animals that would otherwise consume them. If you have ever seen a photograph of the Shark Bay stromatolites, low, rounded, rock-like mounds of layered microbial mats sitting in the shallow, clear water, you have seen something essentially unchanged from the Archean. The organisms are not identical to their 3.5 billion-year-old ancestors, but the structure they build, the principle by which they operate, is the same. The cyanobacteria that built those stromatolites were not the first photosynthetic organisms. Earlier photosynthesizers existed, bacteria that used hydrogen sulfide instead of water as their electron donor and released sulfur instead of oxygen as their waste product. These anoxygenic photosynthesizers are still found today in environments like sulfurous hot springs. But it was the cyanobacteria, the organisms that split water using the energy of sunlight, that changed the world. Because water is abundant on this planet in a way that hydrogen sulfide is not, and because the byproduct of splitting water is oxygen, the cyanobacteria were plugging into an enormous, virtually unlimited source of raw material for photosynthesis. And as they did, they were slowly, molecule by molecule, filling the sky with a gas that would transform everything. Approximately 2.5 billion years ago, something happened to this planet that was, at the time, one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of life. And yet it was also the event that made you possible. The oxygen levels in Earth's atmosphere began to rise, not quickly. Nothing in the history of this planet that matters truly happens quickly, but inexorably over millions of years, the cyanobacteria in their shallow seas continued to photosynthesize, continued to release oxygen, and the composition of the air above them began to shift. Scientists call this the Great Oxidation Event, and it marks one of the most profound transitions in Earth's entire 4.5 billion year history. For the microbes that had evolved in an oxygen-free world, this was a catastrophe. Oxygen is, chemically speaking, a very reactive element. It attacks organic molecules. It interferes with metabolic processes that evolved in its absence. For the vast majority of life that existed on Earth at the time, the great diversity of anaerobic bacteria and archaea that had spent 2 billion years adapting to a world without it, rising oxygen concentrations were toxic. Many lineages simply went extinct. Others retreated to environments where oxygen could not reach them, to the deep ocean, to sediments, to pockets below the soil where even today their descendants still live, carrying on the ancient chemistry of a world that no longer exists at the surface. But for a small subset of organisms, oxygen was not a threat, it was an opportunity. Because oxygen, as toxic as it is also extraordinarily useful. The chemical reactions involved in aerobic respiration, in using oxygen to extract energy from food, are far more efficient than the anaerobic alternatives. An organism that can breathe oxygen can extract roughly 18 times more energy from the same amount of food than one that cannot. This is an enormous advantage. And so the stage was set for a new world, a world of oxygen-breathing life that would, over the next 2 billion years, grow slowly and steadily more complex. But first, the planet had another transformation to undergo. The Great Oxidation Event did not merely change the atmosphere. It triggered a global ice age, in fact, the most severe ice age in Earth's history. The methane in the early atmosphere had been a potent greenhouse gas, helping keep the young Earth warm despite a somewhat dimmer sun. As oxygen rose and reacted with the methane, that greenhouse warming was reduced. The planet cooled. Ice spread from the poles toward the equator. There is evidence that at certain times during this period, the ice may have extended all the way to equatorial latitudes, turning the entire Earth into a frozen ball that scientists have called, evocatively, Snowball Earth. The Snowball Earth episodes are among the most dramatic and controversial chapters in the history of our planet's climate. The evidence for them is preserved in ancient rocks around the world, glacial deposits found at latitudes that 2 billion years ago were near the equator, rocks that show the scratches and polish left by glaciers grinding over them at places where glaciers have no business being. Picture the Earth during one of these events, white from pole to pole, the ocean frozen solid to depths of hundreds of meters, the sky above a cloudless blue, stunningly, painfully cold. The sun still shining, but its light simply reflecting off the ice back into space, unable to warm a surface that reflects rather than absorbs its energy. Did any life survive? Almost certainly. In the deep ocean, away from the frozen surface, hydrothermal vents would have continued pumping warm, mineral-rich water into the dark. In cracks and fissures in the ice, thin films of liquid water may have persisted. And in those refugia, life clung on, waiting, as it always does, for conditions to improve. And conditions did improve, because even as the surface froze, volcanic activity continued beneath and at the ice. Carbon dioxide continued to accumulate in the atmosphere. And eventually, over millions of years, the greenhouse effect reasserted itself. The ice melted and the world emerged from its frozen sleep, radically transformed, but still alive. The eon that followed the Great Oxidation Event is called the Proterozoic, from the Greek for earlier life. It lasted from 2.5 billion years ago to about 540 million years ago, Another nearly 2 billion years of Earth history, another span of time that is almost impossible to truly comprehend. For much of the Proterozoic, the world would have looked to a human observer remarkably empty. The land was bare rock and dust and thin mats of photosynthetic microbes. The sky had more oxygen than in the Archean, but still far less than today, and it was tinged with haze from the chemical reactions taking place in the upper atmosphere. The ocean was more complex, patchy with mats of cyanobacteria, with chemical gradients between shallow oxygenated waters and deeper, still anoxic zones. But beneath this apparent emptiness, something profound was happening. Within the cells of certain bacteria, a new kind of life was evolving. The story of how this happened is one of the most remarkable in all of biology. Among the anaerobic bacteria of the Proterozoic seas, some were being engulfed by larger cells, not digested but incorporated. The engulfed bacteria, instead of being broken down, continued to live inside their hosts. They metabolized, they reproduced, and they provided their hosts with a service, energy, in the form of chemical compounds. This process, called endosymbiosis, happened multiple times. One lineage of small, oxygen-consuming bacteria became the mitochondria, the energy-generating organelles found in nearly every complex cell on Earth today, including every cell in your body. Another lineage of photosynthetic cyanobacteria became the chloroplasts in plant cells. And from this partnership, this ancient accidental collaboration between cells that had simply failed to eat one another, arose the eukaryotes, cells with a membrane-bound nucleus, cells with internal organelles, cells orders of magnitude larger and more complex than anything that had existed before. The first eukaryotes appeared perhaps 2 billion years ago, though the exact timing remains a subject of research. For a long time they remained single-celled, the first amoebas and algae, invisible to the naked eye, moving slowly through the ancient seas. But they had something that prokaryotes lacked, internal complexity that would eventually allow for something prokaryotes had never managed. Multicellularity. The ability to form a body made of many cells, each with a specialized role, cooperating to sustain an organism larger and more capable than any single cell could ever be. This was the next great leap, and it too emerged in the Proterozoic, though it would not reach its full flowering until the Ediacaran and Cambrian periods that followed. Imagine the ocean during the late Proterozoic, perhaps 800 million years ago. The water is clearer than in the early Archean, more oxygenated, more like something you might recognize. Thick mats of algae and cyanobacteria carpet the shallow seafloor in green and blue-green. In the water column above, single-celled algae drift in vast invisible clouds. The chemistry of the ocean is still different from today. There are places where iron and sulfur compounds still dominate deeper waters, but the overall trend is toward a more modern chemistry. And somewhere in those waters the first tiny simple multicellular organisms are beginning to form. Not yet the animals, not yet the plants or fungi that you are familiar with, but the very earliest ancestors, sheets of cells clumped together, coordinating their activities in simple ways, persisting long enough for natural selection to begin shaping them toward complexity. The first animal-like cells were probably filter feeders, soft, simple bodies that strained organic particles from the water. The earliest fungi-like cells were absorbers, secreting enzymes and taking in the breakdown products of dead organic material. The earliest plant-like cells were photosynthesizers, spreading thin sheets of chlorophyll-bearing tissue toward the sunlight. None of these early multicellular organisms left fossils that we have found. They were too soft, too simple, and the geological record of that time is poorly preserved. But we know they existed because their descendants, all of us, everything alive today, are evidence enough. The Proterozoic world, for all its apparent emptiness, was a world of unceasing innovation. Every million years, every 10 million years, something new was being tried. Most experiments failed, most lineages went extinct in some local catastrophe, some change in chemistry, some shift in temperature, but some survived. Some found something that worked, and those survivors were the ancestors of everything. Let your thoughts rest in those ancient, warm, shallow seas, the light filtering down through clear water onto carpets of soft green life. The silence. No calls, no splashes, no footsteps, only the movement of water and the almost imperceptible working of chemistry at the microscopic scale. All that time, all those years, all that quiet, persistent effort. And still, the most dramatic chapters of the story were yet to come. The Proterozoic eukaryotes were extraordinary in one key respect. They had sex. Not sex in the sense we typically think of it, the physical act, the courtship, the complexity, but sex in the biological sense of genetic recombination. The ability to combine genetic material from two different individuals, producing offspring that were genetically different from either parent. In asexual reproduction, which is what bacteria typically do, offspring are essentially copies of the parent, differing only by occasional mutations. Evolution proceeds by the slow accumulation of these mutations, with natural selection weeding out the harmful ones and occasionally preserving beneficial ones. It is a slow process. Sex is faster. When two individuals with different genetic variants combine their DNA, the offspring can receive combinations of variants that neither parent had. New combinations can be tested by selection. Evolution can sample far more of the space of possible genomes than asexual reproduction allows. The evolution of sex, or more precisely the evolution of meiosis and genetic recombination, is therefore thought to have enormously accelerated the pace of evolution, particularly once it combined with multicellularity to allow for the division of genetic labour. Cells in a multicellular organism can specialise. Some become muscle cells, some become nerve cells, some become reproductive cells, because they have the same complete genome as every other cell in the organism, and different parts of that genome are activated in different cell types. The combination of sex and multicellularity created a new kind of entity, an organism that was more than the sum of its cells, an organism with a body plan, with differentiated tissues, with coordinated behaviour. The first such organisms were simple, sheets and threads of cells perhaps with minimal differentiation, but the principle was established, and given time, evolution would build upon it. The Neoproterozoic, the later part of the Proterozoic from roughly 1 billion to 540 million years ago, saw the first diversification of complex multicellular organisms. This was also the period of the Snowball Earth episodes and the formation of the Ediacaran biota. The connections between these events are a subject of active research. Did the Snowball Earth episodes, by creating extreme environmental stress, drive evolutionary innovation? Or did the evolution of complex life, by changing the carbon cycle, contribute to the climate changes that led to the Snowball Earth? The answers are not fully clear. The world is complicated, and cause and effect at geological timescales are rarely simple. What is clear is that by the beginning of the Ediacaran, approximately 635 million years ago, the world had changed enough in its chemistry, its climate, its biology, that something new was possible. Something that had not been possible in the simpler older world of the Archean and early Proterozoic. Complex macroscopic multicellular life. The Ediacaran organisms, for all their strangeness, represent a genuine leap in the complexity and scale of life. They were not microscopic. They could be seen with the naked eye, felt with the hand. Some were larger than a human hand. They were not merely collections of identical cells. They had differentiated regions, different structures in different parts of their bodies. They grew. They responded to their environment. They were, in a meaningful sense, animals, or at the very least, animal-grade organisms. The sediments in which Ediacaran fossils are preserved tell us much about the world they inhabited. The fine-grained, muddy seafloor sediments that preserve the impressions of Ediacaran bodies required specific conditions to accumulate. Quiet water, low in oxygen at the sediment surface, where the usual armies of sediment-disturbing organisms were absent or rare. These were not dynamic, turbulent environments. They were quiet, still, gentle. The preservation itself is extraordinary. Soft-bodied organisms almost never fossilize. They decay too quickly, consumed by bacteria and scavengers, dispersed by water movement. That we have any Ediacaran fossils at all is a matter of exceptional geological luck. The right sediment, in the right chemical conditions, at the right time, in the right places. We have found Ediacaran fossil sites on every continent. The original Australian site in the Ediacara Hills, the extraordinary exposures of the Mistaken Point in Newfoundland, where Ediacaran organisms are preserved in remarkable detail on bedding plains exposed by erosion, the White Sea region of Russia, with its abundant Dickinsonia and other forms. Sites in China, Africa, Scandinavia. The global distribution of the Ediacaran fauna suggests it inhabited oceans around the world, a successful, diverse biota that occupied the seafloors for tens of millions of years. And then, at the Ediacaran-Cambrian boundary, most of it disappeared. The fate of the Ediacaran organisms at the end of their period is one of the mysteries of paleontology. Most of the distinctive Ediacaran forms, the quilted, frond-like, mattress-like shapes that define the period, do not appear in Cambrian rocks. They are simply gone. Whether they went extinct in a mass extinction event, whether they were outcompeted by the newly evolving Cambrian animals, whether they evolved into Cambrian forms that are not yet recognized as descendants, these are open questions. What is clear is that the world of the Cambrian was fundamentally different from the world of the Ediacaran, and the agent of that difference was predation. The evolution of the first macroscopic predators, animals that actively hunted and killed other animals, changed everything. It changed the architecture of animal bodies, driving the evolution of shells and spines and hard parts. It changed the behavior of animals, driving the evolution of active locomotion and sensory systems capable of detecting and evading threats. It changed the ecology of the ocean, creating hierarchies of predators and prey that persist to this day. The Cambrian Ocean was not a happier or better world than the Ediacaran. It was more violent, more dangerous, more dynamic. But it was the world that produced all subsequent animal life, because the evolutionary pressures of predation drove the rapid development of all the key features, nervous systems, muscles, sensory organs, coordinated behavior, that define complex animals. And from that dynamic, predator-driven Cambrian Ocean, given 530 more million years of evolution, came everything you know. There is a period of time, stretching from roughly 635 million years ago to 540 million years ago, that holds a special and somewhat mysterious place in the story of life on Earth. It is called the Ediacaran, named for the Ediacara Hills of South Australia, where the fossils that define it were first found in abundance in the 1940s, and the creatures that lived in the Ediacaran Ocean were unlike anything that had come before and unlike almost anything that exists today. They were soft. They were flat. Many of them were large, some reaching a metre or more in length, remarkable dimensions for organisms that had no bones, no shell, no hard parts of any kind. They left impressions in the fine seafloor sediments in which they rested, delicate fern-like fronds, rounded discs, quilted mattress-like forms that have no clear parallel among modern animals. For a long time after their discovery, scientists puzzled over what exactly the Ediacaran organisms were. Were they animals? Were they giant protists? Single-celled organisms that had grown to extraordinary sizes? Were they fungi or algae or something else entirely? A separate, independent experiment in multicellular life that left no descendants? The debate continues. Some Ediacaran organisms do appear to be early animals, relatives of modern jellyfish and sea anemones, or perhaps more primitive still. Others seem genuinely alien, belonging to no group of modern life with any confidence. But whatever they were, they populated the seafloor of the Ediacaran Ocean in remarkable numbers and diversity, and they did so in conditions quite different from the earlier Proterozoic. The Ediacaran world was recovering from the last of the great snowball Earth episodes. The ice had melted, the oceans were warming, oxygen levels were rising towards something approaching modern concentrations, at least in the shallow, sunlit waters of the continental shelves, and in those warm, oxygenated, relatively shallow seas, the experiment in multicellular life was accelerating. Imagine the seafloor of an Ediacaran sea, perhaps 560 million years ago. The water above is clear and warm, sunlight penetrating to the bottom in shimmering, wavering columns. The sediment beneath is fine and silty, soft and smooth, perfect for preserving impressions, which is why we know so much about what lived there. And on that sediment, in that gentle light, extraordinary shapes are growing. Rangimorpha, organisms that look like ferns or fractal branching structures, anchored to the seafloor, their fronds spreading upward into the water, absorbing nutrients directly through their surfaces. They may have been absorbing dissolved organic molecules from the water, or photosynthesizing, or doing something else entirely that we cannot quite reconstruct. Dickinsonia, one of the most famous Ediacaran organisms, a flat, oval or elongate creature with a ribbed pattern, lying on the seafloor or perhaps moving slowly across it. Some researchers believe Dickinsonia was an early animal. Others have suggested it was a giant single-celled organism or a fungus-like form. The discovery of cholesterol in fossilized Dickinsonia specimens in 2018 was significant because cholesterol is produced by animals, which led many scientists to accept its animal nature, though the debate still has not fully settled. Charnidiscus and similar frond-like organisms attached to the seafloor by a hold-fast and swaying gently in the current, their bodies built of what appears to be stacked modules, a form of organization that has no clear modern equivalent. Kimberella, perhaps the most intriguing of the ediacaran organisms, a bilaterian animal, meaning it had a front and a back, a left and a right, just as you do, that may have been feeding on microbial mats. Scratch marks in the sediment near Kimberella fossils suggest it was rasping food from the seafloor surface, perhaps using a structure analogous to the radula found in modern mollusks. And then there are the trace fossils, not the impressions of bodies but the impressions of behaviour, tiny trails and burrows in the sediment that show something was moving through the ediacaran seafloor. Something was searching, perhaps for food, perhaps for a better resting place. The ability to move through sediment requires a certain degree of muscular organisation, a certain degree of body architecture. These trace fossils represent the earliest direct evidence of animals, genuinely bilateral muscular animals, in the history of the Earth. The ediacaran world had no predators, or at least none that we have found convincing evidence of. It was, in a sense, an ecological paradise, a vast, peaceful seafloor garden of soft creatures, floating fronds and resting blobs and slowly crawling bilaterians, going about their lives in an ocean that had not yet discovered the concept of being eaten. This would change. But for now, in those quiet ediacaran seas, life was diversifying in ways and at rates that had never before been seen. The oxygen-rich water allowed larger bodies and more energetic metabolisms. The abundance of organic material, the vast thick mats of bacteria and algae that carpeted the seafloor, provided food. And evolution, patient and relentless, was working through the possibilities. Something else was happening during the ediacaran, something that would shape the physical world for hundreds of millions of years to come. The continents were moving. The movement of continents, what we call plate tectonics, had been operating since at least the Archean, perhaps even earlier. The crust of the Earth is divided into large, rigid plates that move, driven by convection currents in the hot mantle below. Where plates collide, mountains rise. Where they pull apart, new seafloor forms. Where one plate dives beneath another, volcanoes and earthquakes mark the boundary. During the Proterozoic and into the Ediacaran, all of the land masses of the Earth were gathered together into a supercontinent called Rodinia. Rodinia was enormous, a single landmass containing all or most of the continental crust of the planet, surrounded by a vast global ocean. It formed roughly 1 billion years ago and held together for several hundred million years before beginning to break apart around 750 million years ago. The breakup of Rodinia had consequences for climate, for ocean circulation, for the chemistry of the seas. It may even have been connected to the Snowball Earth episodes. The exposure of fresh rock to weathering as the continents separated drew down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, cooling the planet. As the Ediacaran drew to a close, the former fragments of Rodinia were drifting, rearranging themselves into new configurations. The land masses that would eventually become the continents you know were scattered across a warmer, more equitable world than what had existed in the depths of the Snowball Earth. And in the ocean something was building. The calm of the Ediacaran seafloor garden was coming to an end. The quiet experiment in soft, passive, unpressured life was about to be disrupted by a development so dramatic, so sudden in geological terms, so explosive in its consequences, that it would transform the ocean forever and set the evolutionary stage for every complex animal that has ever lived, including the dinosaurs, and eventually including you. Rest now in the image of that last Ediacaran garden, the gentle fronds swaying in warm water, the soft shapes lying on clean sediment, the clear water filtering sunlight to the floor. It is a scene of extraordinary tranquility, a world that had no concept of teeth or claws, no urgency, no fear. It would be the last world that didn't know those things. 538 million years ago, the world changed. In geological terms, it changed almost overnight, in a window of perhaps 10 to 20 million years, which is an eye blink in the context of the 4 billion years that had come before. In the fossil record, the change is stark and dramatic. Below a certain boundary layer in rocks around the world, you find almost nothing but microbial mats and the soft impressions of ediacaran organisms. Above that line, suddenly, you find shells, you find eyes, you find claws and spines and legs. You find animals. The Cambrian explosion, as this event is known, was not an explosion in the conventional sense. No single catastrophe triggered it. No meteor struck, no volcano erupted, no sudden catastrophe befell the world. It was, instead, an explosion of biological diversity, an eruption of new body plans, new ecological strategies, new ways of living and eating and surviving, that played out over millions of years but still seemed, by the standards of deep geological time, almost instantaneous. What caused it? Scientists have debated this question since Charles Darwin first grappled with it in The Origin of Species. He found the sudden appearance of complex animals in the fossil record deeply troubling for his theory of gradual evolution. The honest answer is that we do not fully know, but we have several good ideas. One factor was oxygen. By the beginning of the Cambrian, oxygen levels in the atmosphere and oceans had risen to perhaps 40 or 50% of their modern levels, high enough to support the more energetic metabolisms that active muscular animals require. Another factor was the ecology of the ocean itself. The ediacaran had been, ecologically speaking, simple. Organisms sat or moved slowly and absorbed food or filtered it from the water. There were no predators, or very few. There was no arms race, no evolutionary pressure to be faster or harder or sharper or more defended. When predators finally evolved, everything changed. The first predators of the Cambrian were the trigger that transformed the ocean. Once something could eat you, it became advantageous to have a shell, to protect your soft body from being consumed. Once shells evolved, it became advantageous to have harder, stronger mouthparts to break those shells. Once hard mouthparts evolved, it became advantageous to have better shells. The evolutionary arms race, once begun, accelerated. Within a few millions of years, the ocean had gone from a quiet garden to something that would be recognizable in its broad ecological outlines as a marine ecosystem. Prey and predators, grazers and ambush hunters, filter feeders and scavengers, animals that burrowed and animals that swam, and animals that climbed over one another in the competition for food and space and survival. The fossils of the early Cambrian ocean are extraordinary. The most celebrated window into this world is the Burgess Shale, discovered in the Canadian Rockies in 1909 by the paleontologist Charles Doolittle Walcott. The Burgess Shale preserves, in astonishing detail, the soft-bodied animals of a Cambrian seafloor community, animals whose soft tissues were preserved when a mudslide rapidly buried them in an oxygen-free environment where decay could not easily proceed. From the Burgess Shale and similar sites around the world, the Chengjiang deposit in China, the Emu Bay Shale in Australia, dozens of others, we have a picture of the Cambrian Ocean that is genuinely spectacular. There was Anomalocaris, the great predator of the early Cambrian, an animal that could reach lengths of 60 centimetres or more, with large compound eyes and circular grasping mouthparts ringed with teeth. Anomalocaris was probably the largest animal in the Cambrian Ocean, a terrifying hunter in a world that was just learning the concept of being hunted. There was Opperbenia, one of the strangest animals ever to have lived, with 5 eyes arranged along the top of its head and a long, flexible proboscis tipped with a grasping claw that it used to catch prey. Opperbenia belonged to no modern animal group. It was an experiment that evolution tried and then, after millions of years, abandoned. There was Hallucigenia, aptly named, a creature so strange that when scientists first studied it, they could not agree which end was the front and which was the back, or whether its spines pointed up or down. It walked on paired legs along the seafloor, protected by spines along its back, and is now recognized as a relative of modern velvet worms. There was Pikaia, a small swimming creature with a notochord running along its length, a flexible rod that stiffened its body for swimming. Pikaia was one of the earliest known chordates, the group that would eventually give rise to fish and then to amphibians, and then to reptiles, and then to mammals and birds. And there were trilobites. The trilobites deserve a special mention because they were not merely present at the Cambrian explosion, they were one of its defining characters. Trilobites were arthropods, relatives of modern crabs and insects, with a distinctive three-lobed body divided into a head, a thorax of multiple segments, and a tail. They had compound eyes that were, in some lineages, extraordinarily sophisticated, among the most complex eyes of any animal that has ever lived. Trilobites would go on to be one of the most successful groups of animals in the history of the Earth. They survived for nearly 300 million years, longer than the entire span from the first dinosaurs to the present day. They diversified into thousands of species, ranging from tiny planktonic forms a few millimeters long to large bottom dwellers 30 or 40 centimeters long. They lived in every marine environment, swam in open water and burrowed in sediment and crawled over reefs. They were beautiful in their alien, ancient way. Their exoskeletons, precisely articulated and exquisitely detailed, are among the most common and most beloved of all fossils. The Cambrian Ocean was a world in the midst of a revolution. Every rock layer from this period tells a new story, new species appearing, new body plans being tried, old ones going extinct. The pace of evolution was extraordinary, driven by the escalating arms race of predator and prey, and by the sheer ecological opportunity of an ocean that was, in many respects, empty of the complex communities that would eventually fill it, but rich with food and space. By the end of the Cambrian, about 485 million years ago, the ocean had changed beyond recognition from what it had been 100 million years before. The quiet Ediacaran garden was a distant memory. In its place was a complex, dynamic ecosystem of animals, grazing, hunting, hiding, competing, evolving. And on the land there was nothing, not a plant, not an insect, not a worm, just bare rock and thin bacterial mats, baking in the sun, swept by winds across an utterly lifeless surface. But that was about to begin to change too. Let your mind rest in the image of that Cambrian sea, the complex, teeming, extraordinary world of the ocean floor 500 million years ago. Anomalocaris patrolling the water above, its great eyes scanning for prey, trilobites moving purposefully across the sediment, strange, soft creatures in extraordinary shapes drifting in the current. Life had discovered complexity. It was never going to look back. The eyes of Cambrian animals deserve a special note, because they represent one of the most important and intriguing developments of the entire explosion. The evolution of eyes, of true optical organs capable of forming images, was a revolutionary development that may have been one of the triggers of the Cambrian explosion itself. This idea, known as the light switch theory, was proposed by the paleontologist Andrew Parker. Before the Cambrian, the argument goes, eyes did not exist, and animals could not see one another. Without vision, there was no advantage to coloration, to rapid movement, to defensive armour. No advantage, in other words, to most of the features that drive the evolutionary arms races we associate with the Cambrian explosion. The evolution of image-forming eyes suddenly made all of these features relevant, triggering a cascade of evolutionary responses as prey evolved to avoid detection and predators evolved to be better hunters. The eyes of the trilobites are among the oldest known complex eyes in the fossil record. Compound eyes, made of many individual lenses, similar in principle to the compound eyes of modern flies and dragonflies. Some trilobite eyes were remarkably sophisticated. The schizochrole eyes of certain advanced trilobites had lenses made of calcite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate, designed to correct for the optical distortions that would otherwise blur the image formed by a mineral lens in water. The optics are elegant, and they required precise biological manufacturing to produce. Anomalocaris had large compound eyes mounted on stalks, eyes that were, in the context of the Cambrian Ocean, extraordinarily powerful. An animal that could see you from meters away, in an ocean where most other animals could detect movement only at close range, would have had an enormous advantage as a predator. The Cambrian Ocean was also the birthplace of the first clear examples of animal behaviour, of movement, search, predation, and evasion that go beyond the simple reflexes of earlier organisms. The trace fossils of the Cambrian, the burrows and trails preserved in ancient seafloor sediments, reveal animals searching for food, fleeing from threats, establishing territories, perhaps even communicating. The behavioural complexity of Cambrian animals was orders of magnitude greater than anything that had existed in the Ediacaran. There is a site in Greenland, the Sirius Passet locality, that preserves Cambrian animals from perhaps 520 million years ago in exceptional detail, complementing the slightly younger Burgess Shale fauna. There is the Chengjiang biota of Yunnan province in China, dated to about 518 million years ago, which has produced thousands of specimens with preserved soft tissue and has fundamentally changed our understanding of early animal evolution. These Lagerstätten, the German word for geological deposits with exceptionally preserved fossils, are windows into the Cambrian world that are irreplaceable. The Chengjiang fauna is particularly notable for the diversity of vertebrate-like and vertebrate animals it contains. Yunnanozoon and Haikuella were soft-bodied animals, with features suggesting they were close to the vertebrate lineage. Haikuichthus and Miloconmingia appear to be early true fish, with rudimentary vertebral columns and other vertebrate features. These tiny swimming animals, a centimetre or two long, were the ancestors of all vertebrates, all the fish, all the tetrapods, all the reptiles and mammals and birds, including you. Pause for a moment and let that sink in gently. The entire vertebrate lineage, every animal with a backbone, every fish and frog and lizard and bird and deer and you yourself, traces its origin to something like Haikuichthys, a tiny, simple swimming animal in a warm Cambrian sea 518 million years ago. If you had seen it, you would not have noticed it among the many extraordinary creatures around it. You would not have said, "There goes the future." But it was. After the Cambrian came the Ordovician, and the world kept building. The Great Ordovician biodiversification event filled the ocean with a diversity of life that surpassed even the Cambrian in terms of the number of genera and ecological types. Reefs grew larger and more complex. Brachiopods and crinoids carpeted the shallow seafloor in communities of extraordinary density and diversity. It was during the Ordovician that the ocean first came to look something like a modern marine ecosystem in its basic structure, with filter feeders on the bottom, predators in the water column, scavengers picking through the debris, bacteria breaking down the organic material that fell to the seafloor. The roles are familiar, even if the actors are entirely different. A medieval English village and a modern American city have similar social roles. Farmers, traders, judges, guards, even though everything about them looks different. The Ordovician ocean had the right roles, even if it had the wrong species. The Ordovician also saw the first tentative colonization of the land by plants. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that the Ordovician saw the ancestors of land plants, green algae growing in fresh water or in the spray zone at the edge of the sea, begin to develop the physiological traits that would eventually allow their descendants to live on dry land. The transition from aquatic algae to land plant was not sudden. It involved millions of years of incremental adaptation, the development of waxy coatings to prevent desiccation, the development of structures to anchor in sediment, the development of mechanisms to absorb water from the substrate rather than simply absorbing it from the surrounding water. By the late Ordovician, tiny, simple plant-like organisms, perhaps similar to modern liverworts, had established themselves on the moist surfaces of rocks near water. They were not dramatic, they were not visible from a distance, but they were there, the first land plants, clinging to existence in the spray of an ancient sea, beginning the process that would, over the next 100 million years, cover the continents with green. And then the ice came, and the first great extinction of complex animal life swept across the ocean, and the world reset once more. But it reset to a higher level than before, more diverse, more complex, with more ecological roles filled, more evolutionary experiments underway. Each recovery added new layers to the complexity of life. Each extinction cleared space for new experiments. The history of life is not a smooth upward curve. It is a jagged line, interrupted by catastrophes, but trending over hundreds of millions of years toward greater and greater complexity, toward eventually the remarkable and improbable present. After the Cambrian, the story of life on Earth moves into a long and fascinating middle chapter, one that saw the ocean grow ever richer and more complex, while the land began, slowly and tentatively, its own transformation from a barren wasteland into something alive. The Ordovician period, which followed the Cambrian from about 485 million years ago to 443 million years ago, was a time of extraordinary marine diversification. The Cambrian had established the basic body plans. The Ordovician built on them, filling the ocean with an astonishing variety of life in what scientists sometimes call the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. Imagine the ocean of the Middle Ordovician, perhaps 460 million years ago. The seafloor in shallow tropical seas is carpeted with extraordinary diversity. Crinoids, relatives of modern sea lilies, sway in the current, their feathery arms outstretched to catch particles of food drifting past. They are animals, though they look like flowers, anchored to the seafloor by long stalks. In dense meadows, they cover the bottom for miles. Brachiopods, shelled organisms that superficially resemble modern clams but are actually quite different, with a completely separate evolutionary history, carpet the surfaces between the crinoids in vast numbers. They are everywhere in the Ordovician Ocean, one of the defining organisms of the age, their shells preserving beautifully in the rock. Bryozoans, tiny colonial animals that build intricate branching or encrusting structures of calcium carbonate, form reefs and mounds on the seafloor. These are among the first true reefs, not yet built by corals as modern reefs are, but by these small filter-feeding colonial animals that would build similar structures for hundreds of millions of years. And in the water above, new things are swimming. The first true fish, vertebrates, animals with a backbone, had appeared by the Cambrian, represented by forms like Pikaia. By the Ordovician, they were diversifying. These early fish were jawless. The first jawed fish would not appear until later, and their bodies were often covered with bony plates, a kind of external armour that may have protected them from the predators of the period. The open water teemed with cephalopods, relatives of modern squid and octopus, but living in long, straight or coiled shells. The largest of these, called orthoceratids, could reach lengths of several metres, enormous predators of the Ordovician Sea drifting through the water column and seizing prey with their tentacles. But this flourishing world ended in catastrophe. At the end of the Ordovician, approximately 443 million years ago, one of the most severe mass extinctions in Earth's history struck the ocean. In just a few million years, roughly 85% of all marine species were wiped out. The crinoid meadows were devastated. The brachiopod diversity collapsed. Many lineages of trilobite went extinct, though the group survived. The orthoceratid cephalopods were largely destroyed. The cause was a massive glaciation, another great ice age, this time centred on the south polar continent of Gondwana, which at this time occupied the southern polar region. As ice accumulated on Gondwana, sea levels fell dramatically. The water was locked up in ice sheets. The shallow continental shelves that had been the richest marine habitats were drained. The glaciation also cooled the entire ocean, disrupting the warm water ecosystems that had proliferated during the warm Ordovician. It ended relatively quickly in geological terms, but the damage was done. The post-extinction world was a depleted one, an ocean that would take millions of years to rebuild its diversity. The rebuilding happened during the Silurian period, from 443 million years ago to 419 million years ago. The Silurian was, compared to the dramatic events that flanked it, a relatively quiet time. The climate stabilised, the ice melted, sea levels rose again, and life, as it always does, recovered and diversified. The Silurian ocean saw important innovations. True coral reefs appeared for the first time, not just the bryozoan mounds of the Ordovician, but structures built largely by coral animals and stromatoporoids, the ancestors of modern sponges. These reefs were enormous, stretching across tropical seas in warm, clear, shallow water. And in those Silurian seas, fish were becoming increasingly important. The first jawed fish appeared during the Silurian, a development of enormous evolutionary significance. Jaws opened up new ecological roles. With jaws, a fish could bite, could capture active prey, could process hard-shelled food that jawless mouths could not manage. The diversity of fish increased rapidly. But the most consequential development of the Silurian was not happening in the ocean at all. It was happening at the water's edge. The land, by the Silurian, was no longer entirely bare. Mosses and liverworts, simple, low-growing plants without true roots or vascular systems, had colonized the edges of ponds and streams, forming thin green carpets on the damp rock. These were the descendants of green algae that had made the transition from water to land, a transition that required extraordinary adaptations, because the land is in many ways a hostile environment for an organism adapted to life in water. On land, there is no water to support the weight of your body. On land, you dry out if you're not careful. On land, you're exposed to ultraviolet radiation that the water filters out. And yet the land offered what the increasingly crowded ocean could not: space, sunlight available without competition, resources not yet exploited. And so, during the Silurian and the following Devonian period, the land was invaded. First by plants, then, following the plants and the organic material they produced, by animals. The first land plants with true vascular systems of tubes that could move water and nutrients up from the soil through the plant's body, appeared in the early Silurian. These early vascular plants were small and simple, without true leaves or roots, more like the small green strands of moss than anything you might recognize as a plant. But they were a beginning. And following them came the first land animals, not vertebrates, not yet. The first animals to colonize the land were tiny arthropods, mites, and millipede-like creatures that could find shelter in the thin soils developing beneath the first plant communities. They were small, perhaps a few millimeters long, but they were there, living, breathing, feeding in a world that had, until very recently, been utterly without animal life. The land was awakening. Let your thoughts drift across the surface of that early land, the bare rock giving way to patches of green, thin soils forming in sheltered hollows, tiny creatures moving carefully among the low stems of the earliest vascular plants. The air would have smelled different, clean and mineral, with perhaps the faint organic scent of the growing plants, a smell unlike anything that exists on Earth today. A world being born, slowly and without fanfare, in the spaces between the ancient ocean and the open sky. The Silurian reef ecosystems deserve a closer look, because they represent one of the great architectural achievements of early animal life, the construction of physical structures of biological origin that change the environment around them. Modern coral reefs are the most biodiverse marine ecosystems on Earth, supporting roughly a quarter of all known marine species in an area that covers less than 1% of the ocean floor. They are built primarily by coral animals, cyanidarians that secrete skeletons of calcium carbonate, and by coralline algae. But the principle of reef building, of organisms creating physical structures that provide habitat and food resources for vast communities of other organisms, was established long before modern corals appeared. The Silurian reefs were built by a different set of organisms, stromatoporoids, which were sponge-like animals related to modern calcareous sponges, tabulate corals and rugose corals, which are extinct groups only distantly related to modern corals, and bryozoans, which we have already encountered. These organisms secreted calcium carbonate skeletons that accumulated over time into massive structures, reef systems that could reach hundreds of meters in height and extend for hundreds of kilometers along ancient continental shelves. The environment around a Silurian reef would have been immediately familiar to anyone who has snorkeled on a modern coral reef. Clear, warm, sunlit water, a complex three-dimensional structure of carbonate providing innumerable hiding places, foraging surfaces and attachment points, a community of extraordinary density and diversity living in and around the reef. Brachiopods and crinoids were particularly abundant on Silurian reefs, the crinoids especially, with their long stalks anchored to the reef surface and their feathery arms spread to filter food from the current. In places, the crinoid-covered reef surface must have looked like a meadow of slow-moving sea flowers, arms waving gently in the current, the occasional splash of colour from a passing nautiloid or swimming trilobite. It is a scene of extraordinary alien beauty, and it was the template for all subsequent reef systems, all the Devonian reefs and Carboniferous reefs and Mesozoic reefs and the modern reefs we know and worry about today. The principle was established in the Silurian, and nature has been refining it ever since. By the Devonian, the reefs had grown more complex and more diverse. The stromatoporoids remained important, but new groups were adding to the mix. The diversity of organisms associated with reefs expanded, and in the water above them, the extraordinary diversification of fish was creating an increasingly complex predator-prey dynamic in the open ocean. The Devonian Ocean was warm, sea levels were high, the continental shelves were broad and shallow, flooded by warm, productive seas that teemed with fish of every description. The ocean floor was carpeted with invertebrate life. The water column was structured by a hierarchy of predators, from small filter-feeding fish at the bottom to the enormous placoderms at the top. And at the margins of the land, where the rivers met the sea, where the shallow coastal wetlands spread in broad low-lying expanses, the lobe-finned fish were experimenting with the air above. The transition zone between sea and land, the intertidal zone, the freshwater wetlands, the delta systems where rivers spread their sediments into shallow coastal seas, was one of the most productive and ecologically dynamic environments of the Devonian world. It was also, as we have seen, the crucible in which the tetrapod body plan was forged. The Devonian land, away from the water's edge, was being transformed by the first forests. The cladoxylopsid trees of Gilboa, New York, were not the only forest-forming plants of the Devonian. Archaeopteris, a tree that bore fronds somewhat resembling those of modern ferns, but reproduced by seeds rather than spores, was enormously widespread by the late Devonian, forming forests across broad areas of what is now North America, Europe, and perhaps elsewhere. Archaeopteris was, in some respects, the first truly modern tree. It grew tall, it had woody trunks that could persist for many years, and it shed leaves that accumulated on the forest floor as organic debris. The organic debris was important. In the early Devonian, land plant communities were simple enough that the soil beneath them was thin and poorly developed. By the late Devonian, the leaf litter and woody debris from the Archaeopteris forests was accumulating faster than it could be broken down, creating deep, rich soils, the first forest soils in Earth's history. The reason the debris accumulated was not that there was nothing to break it down. It was that the organisms capable of breaking down lignin, the tough, complex polymer that gives wood its structural strength, had not yet evolved. Lignin is a remarkable material. It is resistant to degradation by most organisms, and it was genuinely new in the Devonian. The fungi that eventually evolved to break down lignin, the white rot fungi and brown rot fungi of modern forests, did not appear until later, possibly not until the Carboniferous. This lag between the evolution of lignin-producing trees and the evolution of lignin-degrading fungi may be part of the reason so much carbon was buried in the Carboniferous coal swamps. The trees fell, the lignin in their wood resisted decomposition, the organic material accumulated, and it was eventually buried and compressed into coal. The carbon that had been drawn from the atmosphere by photosynthesis was stored in the rock, removing carbon dioxide from the air and contributing to the cooling that ended the Carboniferous warm period. In this way, the evolution of a single biochemical compound, lignin, had consequences that rippled across millions of years of geological and climate history, from the accumulation of the coal measures that powered the Industrial Revolution to the cooling that preceded the end Permian extinction. The world is like this. Everything is connected across time spans that dwarf human imagination in ways that only become clear when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. The first insects with wings appeared in the early Carboniferous. The first vertebrates with legs had appeared in the late Devonian. The first forests had appeared in the mid-Devonian. The first land plants had appeared in the Silurian. And beneath all of it, reaching back to the Cambrian and the Ediacaran and the Archean, the slow, patient work of 4 billion years of evolution was writing the history of a world. A world that was, at every moment, exactly what it was, complete, functional, beautiful in its own terms, and also a world in transition, always moving towards something it had not yet become. The story of life on Earth is a story without a destination. Evolution has no goal. Natural selection has no purpose. There is no plan, no endpoint, no intended outcome. The extraordinary complexity and beauty of the modern world is not the fulfillment of a design. It is the cumulative product of billions of years of random variation and non-random selection, of accidents and adaptations, of contingency and constraint. And yet, and this is perhaps the most extraordinary thing of all, the result is a world of staggering beauty and complexity, a world of crinoid meadows and Cambrian reefs, and Carboniferous forests and the warm, quiet Ediacaran garden, a world that, at every stage of its long history, was alive in ways it had never been alive before. You are the inheritor of all of it. Every stage of the story, every experiment, every extinction, every recovery, The ancient Archean Ocean is in your chemistry. The Cambrian explosion is in your genes. The Devonian swamps are in the structure of your limbs. The Permian therapsids are in the architecture of your jaw. You are, in the deepest possible sense, a product of the entire history of this planet. And that is a remarkable thing to be. The Devonian period, stretching from 419 million years ago to 359 million years ago, is sometimes called the Age of Fishes, and for good reason. During this 60 million year chapter of Earth history, fish diversified into an extraordinary range of forms and became the dominant vertebrates of the ocean. But it was also a period of sweeping transformation on land. The rise of the first true forests, the evolution of the first four-limbed animals, and the beginning of the vertebrate conquest of dry land. First, the fish. By the early Devonian, the oceans were alive with vertebrates in a way they had never been before. The jawless fish, the oldest vertebrate lineage, still swam the ancient seas, their relatives living today as lampreys and hagfish. But the future belonged to the jawed fish, and the Devonian was the period in which this future announced itself. The first great group of jawed fish were the placoderms, armoured fish covered with plates of bone, ranging from small bottom dwellers a few centimetres long to enormous predators that rank among the most terrifying animals of their era. The most famous of the placoderms was Dunkleosteus, a creature that could reach lengths of 6 metres or more, with enormous self-sharpening bony plates in place of teeth that could generate bite forces among the strongest of any fish that has ever lived. Imagine Dunkleosteus patrolling the warm, shallow Devonian Sea. Its armour-plated head is massive, capable of opening with a rapid snap that created a suction force powerful enough to draw prey into its mouth. Its body, behind the armoured head and thorax, was muscular and flexible, capable of swift movement. It was the apex predator of its time, a position it held for tens of millions of years. But even as Dunkleosteus ruled the open water, other fish were evolving that would eventually displace the placoderms entirely. The ray-finned fish, the group that includes the vast majority of modern fish, from salmon to goldfish to tuna, were diversifying. The lobe-finned fish, a smaller group today, represented only by lungfish and coelacanths, were even more important for the future of life on land. Lobe-finned fish had a distinctive feature. Their paired fins were supported by a series of bones that corresponded, in their basic layout, to the bones of a tetrapod limb. The fin was attached to the body by a single bone, then 2 bones, then a cluster of smaller bones at the end, a pattern you can recognise in your own arm. A single upper arm bone, 2 forearm bones, and the many small bones of your wrist and hand. This was no accident. The lobe-finned fish were the ancestors of all tetrapods, all four-limbed vertebrates, and the bones of their fins were the ancestors of legs. During the late Devonian, a remarkable series of transitional forms documents the evolution of the tetrapod limb from the lobe fin. Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic Canada in 2004, was a fish that could prop itself up on its muscular front fins and perhaps move short distances on land. Acanthostega had true limbs with digits, fingers and toes, but its legs were probably used primarily for moving through shallow water, not for walking on land. Ichthyosteega had a more robust skeleton and could probably move on land for short periods, though clumsily. These transitional animals lived in shallow, swampy, oxygen-poor water, environments where the ability to breathe air and move short distances over mud and vegetation to reach better water would have been advantageous. They represent not a sudden leap from water to land, but a gradual series of adaptations that made life on land possible, developed in animals that were still primarily aquatic. But while the fish story dominated the Devonian Ocean, the most dramatic transformation of the period was happening on land. In the early Devonian, the land plants that had colonised the shores in the Silurian were still small and simple. By the late Devonian, they had grown into forests. The first forests appeared roughly 385 million years ago, a date we can pin down with remarkable precision because of extraordinarily well-preserved fossil trees found at a site called Gilboa in New York State. The Gilboa trees, belonging to a group called Cladoxylopsids, were tall, reaching perhaps 10 metres, with a trunk topped by a crown of branch-like fronds. They did not look quite like any modern tree. They were something new, something that had never existed before, an experiment in treeness that the world had not yet seen. Imagine standing in one of those first Devonian forests. The trees around you are unfamiliar, the wrong shapes, the wrong textures, the wrong proportions. The ground beneath them is covered in lower plants, ferns and club mosses and horsetails, some of them also of impressive size. The air is rich with oxygen, perhaps richer than today, generated by the photosynthesis of all this newly abundant plant life. The smell would have been extraordinary. The sharp, clean smell of plant life in enormous quantities, mixed with the earthier notes of decomposing organic material. The first forest soils, rich in fungi, dark and fertile. And among the roots of those trees, in the leaf litter and soil, the first land-dwelling arthropods were diversifying. Millipedes and early insects, spiders and mites, creatures that fed on the decaying plant material or on each other. The first terrestrial food webs, simple but functional. The forests had a profound effect on the planet's chemistry. Trees, in building their woody bodies, drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at rates far exceeding what had come before. The soil formed beneath the forest was rich and deep, and it too drew down carbon. The result was a significant drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide, and a cooling of the climate. But the Devonian ended, as so many periods in Earth history end, in catastrophe. The late Devonian mass extinction, or more accurately a series of extinction pulses that occurred over several million years at the end of the period, was one of the most severe in Earth's history. Perhaps 75% of all species were lost. The shallow marine ecosystems that had flourished throughout the Devonian, the coral reefs, the diverse communities of fish and invertebrates, were devastated. The placoderms, which had dominated the ocean for 80 million years, were completely wiped out. The cause of the late Devonian extinction is still debated. Possible triggers include volcanic activity, sea level changes, ocean anoxia, a drop in oxygen levels in ocean waters which suffocated marine life, and even the spread of the forests themselves, which by drawing down carbon dioxide may have triggered a cooling event that disrupted global ecosystems. But life survived, as it always had. The vertebrate survivors of the Devonian extinction, including the early tetrapods still clinging to their shallow swamps, would go on to colonize the land in earnest in the period that followed. The stage was set for something new, something that had never existed before. Animals with 4 legs walking on dry ground. Let the image of that first forest settle over you, the unfamiliar shapes of those Devonian trees, the thick oxygen-rich air, the small arthropods moving through the undergrowth. The world was filling up with life, reaching into every available space, trying everything. And in the warm shallows at the edge of that new forest, something was learning to walk. The lobe-finned fish of the Devonian deserve more attention, because their story is the story of us, of all terrestrial vertebrates, and it is a story that played out in the swamps and shallow waters of a world that was itself in the middle of transformation. The tetrapod transition, the evolution of 4-limbed land animals from lobe-finned fish, was once seen as a dramatic, purposeful leap. The fish that walked onto land, the popular imagination suggests, were driven by some imperative, some need, some aspiration toward a new world. But evolution does not work that way. Evolution is blind. It has no foresight and no purpose. The early tetrapods were not trying to colonize the land. They were trying to survive in the water. The environments in which the lobe-finned fish were evolving their terrestrial features were shallow, warm, often oxygen-poor swamps and wetlands. In such environments, the ability to breathe air to supplement or replace gill breathing with lung breathing was advantageous. Many modern fish can breathe air to some degree. Lungfish, the living relatives of the tetrapods, can breathe air so well that they can survive the drying up of their pools by estivating in the mud. Similarly, the ability to move through dense aquatic vegetation, to push through shallow water by pressing muscular fins against the substrate, to crawl short distances over mud to reach a new pool, these were advantages in the specific environment of a Devonian swamp, not adaptations designed for land living. The land was a secondary discovery, an accidental benefit of features that evolved for other reasons in the water. Tiktaalik, discovered by Neil Shubin and his colleagues in Arctic Canada in 2004, is the most celebrated of the transitional tetrapod ancestors. It was found exactly where evolutionary theory predicted it would be, in rocks of the right age, in the right environment, and it looked exactly as predicted. An animal with a fish-like body, scales and fins, but with a flat crocodile-like head and fins supported by the bone arrangement, humerus, radius and ulna small wrist bones, that would become the tetrapod limb. Tiktaalik could prop itself up on its pectoral fins and apparently turn its head separately from its body, the first vertebrate with a neck. The first true tetrapods, animals with forelimbs bearing digits, appear in the fossil record around 375 million years ago. They include Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, both from Greenland. Acanthostega had 8 digits on each limb and was probably primarily aquatic. Its limbs were too weak to support its weight on land, but they would have been useful for moving through dense aquatic vegetation, or bracing against the substrate while feeding. Ichthyostega was more robustly built, with limbs that could probably support some weight on land, though it was still fundamentally an aquatic animal. The first tetrapods to spend significant time on land appeared in the Carboniferous, fully terrestrial animals, with limbs strong enough to carry their weight, with lungs efficient enough to support an active terrestrial metabolism, with skin dry enough to resist desiccation. These were the amniot ancestors and their amphibian cousins, the first vertebrates to truly live on land. Now imagine the Carboniferous forest more fully, the world of 310 million years ago. The air is warmer than today, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer globally, because the arrangement of continents in the Carboniferous creates different ocean circulation patterns than the modern world, and the high oxygen atmosphere traps more heat. The humidity is extraordinary. It is always, everywhere, warm and wet in the equatorial zone of the Carboniferous coal swamps. The coal swamps are not dark and gloomy, as we might imagine from the name. They are bright and green because the canopy of the lycopsid trees is often sparse, letting sunlight through to the lush understory below. The sounds of the Carboniferous forest are alien. There are no birds. Birds will not evolve for another 250 million years. There are no mammals to rustle through the leaf litter. But there are sounds. The constant background drone and chirp of insects in their enormous diversity and abundance. The splashing of amphibians moving through the shallow water between the tree trunks. The occasional rustle and snap of something larger moving through the undergrowth. Perhaps the deep basso rumble of Arthropleura, the giant millipede, as it moves its many legs in the leaf litter. The insects of the Carboniferous were not merely large, they were diverse. The basic insect body plan, 6 legs, 3 body segments, antennae, usually wings, had been established, and evolution was experimenting with it in every direction. The first winged insects appeared in the Carboniferous, and their appearance was itself extraordinary, because wings are one of the most remarkable and consequential structures that evolution has ever produced. The origin of insect wings is still debated. One theory is that wings evolved from gill-like structures on the sides of an aquatic larval ancestor, structures that, in some lineages, were retained through metamorphosis and enlarged. Another theory is that wings evolved from small flaps on the thorax that helped the insect glide, or perhaps helped it stabilize itself while jumping. The truth may incorporate elements of both. What is clear is that once insects had wings, they could fly, and flight opened up ecological niches that had previously been entirely inaccessible, the air itself. The early winged insects, unlike most modern insects, could not fold their wings against their bodies. This is why Meganeura and its relatives are classified in a group called Paleoptera, ancient winged, along with modern dragonflies and mayflies. The ability to fold wings was a later innovation, one that allows insects to crawl into crevices and under bark and into flowers, habitats that the ancient winged insects could not access. The evolution of insect flight, more than almost any other development, transformed the world of the Carboniferous and beyond. Flying insects became pollinators for the early plants, their movements between flowers transferring pollen more effectively than wind or water. They became food for other animals, driving the evolution of insectivores. They became predators of one another, and the aerial arms race between insect predators and insect prey drove the evolution of ever more sophisticated flying abilities and evasion strategies. The aerial ecosystem of the Carboniferous was the first and simplest version of an aerial ecosystem that would grow over the following hundreds of millions of years into the richly complex sky of the modern world, a sky that would eventually contain not only insects but pterosaurs and birds and bats, all of them building on the ecological foundations laid down in the warm, oxygen-rich forests of the coal swamps. In those forests, by the late Carboniferous, the first amniotes had established themselves. The terrestrial ecosystem was beginning to develop something like a complete food web, plants providing the base, herbivorous insects and small amphibians consuming the plants, small amniotes consuming the insects, and larger amphibians and early amniote carnivores at the top. It was simple by modern standards, but it was functional, and it was growing more complex with every million years. And from those small, scurrying amniotes in the undergrowth of the coal swamp, from those first animals free of their dependence on water for reproduction, a line of descent ran forward through time, through two mass extinctions and the rise and fall of Pangaea, through the cold Permian winters and the volcanic summers of the Great Dying, all the way to the first dinosaurs, and then beyond to the mammals that outlasted the dinosaurs, and then beyond again to the primates, and then to the hominids, and then to you. The coal swamp is in you. Its oxygen is in every breath you take. Its compression is in every coal seam under the ground. Its inheritance is in every gene of every cell of your body. The forest that was persists in you. 359 million years ago the Carboniferous period began. It would last until 299 million years ago, another 60 million years of Earth history. And the world it shaped still surrounds you today, in ways you might not expect. The coal you burn, the electricity generated from it, the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution and continues to drive economies around the world, all of it came from the Carboniferous. All of it is the compressed, transformed remnant of those ancient forests, buried and pressure-cooked by hundreds of millions of years of geology. The Carboniferous world was extraordinary. The supercontinent of Pangaea was in the process of assembling itself. Through the collision of tectonic plates and the gathering of land masses, the continents that had been scattered during the earlier Paleozoic were slowly coming together. The resulting continent, Pangaea, or at least its early stages, straddled the equator and extended toward both poles. The climate of the early Carboniferous was warm and humid in the equatorial regions, warm and wet enough to sustain vast swampy forests that covered much of what is now Europe and North America, which at the time were joined together in a landmass called Euramerica. These were the coal swamps, low-lying, waterlogged forests dominated by enormous tree-like lycopsids, relatives of modern club mosses, that could grow to heights of 30 or 40 meters, their trunks covered in distinctive diamond-shaped scale patterns. The lycopsid trees, Lepidodendron, Sigillaria, and their relatives, were different from any tree alive today. They grew rapidly to their full height, branching only at the very top, where they bore cones containing spores. They did not produce rings of wood year by year as modern trees do. Their trunks were largely made of bark. They lived fast and died young by tree standards, and when they fell into the swampy water below, the conditions were often not conducive to decomposition. The organic material accumulated, peat, layer upon layer, compressed by the weight of further sediment, and over hundreds of millions of years became coal. Picture the Carboniferous coal swamp. The air is warm, thick, and humid. The smell of wet vegetation, of organic decay, of living things growing and dying in extraordinary abundance. The water between the trees is shallow and dark, coloured brown by tannins from the fallen leaves and wood. The trees rise above you in columns, their bark rough with the diamond pattern of fallen leaf scars, their canopy lost in the humid haze above. And in that air something extraordinary is flying. The oxygen content of the Carboniferous atmosphere was extraordinarily high, perhaps 35% compared to today's 21%. This high oxygen atmosphere had profound effects on life, particularly on insects, whose respiratory systems depend on simple diffusion of oxygen through small tubes called tracheae. The higher the oxygen concentration, the larger the insect can grow before the diffusion system becomes inadequate. The result was giant insects. Meganeura was a dragonfly-like insect with a wingspan of up to 70 centimeters, larger than a modern crow. It patrolled the coal swamps in search of prey, its wings humming through the humid air. Arthropleura was a millipede, or millipede-like arthropod, that could reach lengths of 2.5 meters, the largest land arthropod that has ever existed, crawling through the undergrowth of the lycopsid forest. Cockroaches, recognizable cockroaches, ancestral forms of the insects still living in your kitchen walls, first appeared in the Carboniferous. They were so abundant that the period is sometimes informally called the Age of Cockroaches. Ammonite-shelled ancestors of modern scorpions walked the forest floor. Early spiders began spinning webs. The oldest known spider web was from this period. The swamps were alive with sound and movement. The buzzing and clicking of arthropods, the splashing of early amphibians moving through the shallow water. The first true forests had reached their fullest expression, the most extraordinary coal swamp world that would ever exist. And among those forests and swamps, the vertebrates that had colonized the land during the Devonian were diversifying. The early tetrapods had given rise to the amphibians, animals that could live and move on land but still needed water to lay their eggs, just as modern frogs and salamanders do. In the warm, wet world of the Carboniferous coal swamps, amphibians thrived. Some became large. Eriops, one of the most famous Carboniferous amphibians, was 1.5 meters long, a stocky, powerful animal that hunted in the swampy water and perhaps on the land around it. But the most consequential innovation of the Carboniferous was not in the swamps. It was in the eggs. Somewhere in the early Carboniferous, perhaps around 310 or 320 million years ago, a group of tetrapods evolved a new kind of egg. Instead of laying soft, jelly-coated eggs that had to remain in water to avoid drying out, these animals produced eggs surrounded by a tough protective membrane, the amnion, that enclosed a small amount of liquid, essentially a portable pond. The amnion protected the embryo from desiccation, allowing the eggs to be laid on dry land, away from the water entirely. These were the first amniotes. The amniot egg was one of the most important evolutionary innovations in the history of vertebrate life. With it, animals were finally free of their dependence on water for reproduction. They could move inland, away from rivers and swamps, into dry environments that had previously been inaccessible to vertebrates. They could exploit food resources, insects, plants, other small animals, in habitats that amphibians could never reach. The first amniotes were small, lizard-like animals, probably insectivores, moving quickly through the undergrowth of the Carboniferous forests. They would not have looked like much, small, agile creatures that would have been easy to overlook among the giants of the coal swamp. But from these small beginnings, all the amniots, all the reptiles, all the birds, all the mammals, including you, would eventually descend. Early in their history, the amniots divided into two great lineages. One group, the sauropsids, would give rise to reptiles, birds, and dinosaurs. The other, the synapsids, would give rise to mammals. The split happened in the Carboniferous, and both lineages were already present and diversifying by the end of the period. The first synapsids were the pelycosaurs, amniotes with a prominent sail on their backs, formed by elongated spines of the vertebrae. The most famous was Dimetrodon, an animal often mistakenly grouped with the dinosaurs in toy stores and museums, but actually far more closely related to you than to any dinosaur. Dimetrodon's sail may have functioned in temperature regulation, collecting heat from the sun in the mornings to warm the animal quickly, or dissipating heat during the hottest part of the day. The Carboniferous ended with a significant cooling event, the collapse of the coal swamps as the climate dried and cooled. The vast equatorial forests contracted, the diversity of amphibians declined, the high oxygen atmosphere began to drop back toward modern levels. The giant insects dependent on that high oxygen shrank toward modern sizes. But the amniotes survived, and they were just getting started. Breathe deeply and settle into the warmth of the Carboniferous night. The coal swamp around you is alive with sound, the chirring of insects, the splash of an amphibian entering the dark water. Above you, the enormous trunks of the leucopsid trees rise toward a hazy sky. The world smells of mud and growth and wet wood. Somewhere in the undergrowth a small, quick animal moves, an amniot with its portable pond sealed inside a leathery egg, and with it the future of all vertebrate life on land. 299 million years ago, the Permian period began. It was the last period of the Paleozoic era, the final chapter of the ancient world, the closing act of the long story that had begun with the Cambrian explosion. And it ended with the most catastrophic mass extinction in Earth's entire history, an event so severe, so total in its devastation, that it almost erased complex life from this planet. But before the ending there was an extraordinary world. By the Permian, the supercontinent of Pangaea had largely assembled. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, in fact for the first time since the distant Proterozoic, nearly all of Earth's landmass was joined into a single body. Pangaea stretched from the North Pole to the South Pole, a vast continent dominated by the interior that was dry and harsh, because a continent of that size generates extreme climates, burning hot in summer, bitterly cold in winter, with little moisture penetrating from the distant coastlines to the vast interior. The ocean that surrounded Pangaea was called Panthalassa, the universal ocean, covering about 70% of the globe's surface. There was also a smaller sea, the Tethys, cutting into Pangaea from the east. These ancient seas were warm and rich, at least in their shallower parts. The Permian world was a world of extremes. Along the margins of Pangaea, in the humid tropical zones, lush forests grew, though they were different from the coal swamps of the Carboniferous. The conifers, ancestors of today's pines and spruces, were becoming important elements of the vegetation. Seed ferns and cycads added to the mix. These plants were better adapted than the leucopsid trees of the Carboniferous to the drier, more variable conditions of a world without the constant, reliable wetness of the coal swamp. In the interior of Pangaea, conditions range from desert to seasonally dry, savanna-like environments. The animals that lived here had to be tough, adaptable, capable of surviving periods of drought and heat. Among the amniotes, this was the era of the synapsids, and their dominant members were the therapsids, a group that represented a significant step toward the mammalian body plan. The therapsids were not the fin-backed, cold-blooded, slow animals that come to mind when we think of reptiles. Many of them were warm-blooded, or at least approaching warm-bloodedness in their physiology. They had more erect postures than their predecessors, with legs held more directly beneath their bodies rather than sprawling to the sides. Their skulls showed differentiated teeth, front teeth for biting, side teeth for shearing, back teeth for crushing, a pattern that is the hallmark of mammals, which have the most elaborately differentiated dentition of any vertebrate group. The most successful therapsids of the mid-Permian were the dicynodonts, herbivores with a beak and two prominent tusk-like teeth, ranging from small burrowing forms to large pig-sized grazers. Dicynodonts were remarkably successful. They were among the most abundant large herbivores of their time, filling the ecological roles that cows and horses fill today. Hunting the dicynodonts were the carnivorous therapsids, the gorgonopsids and cynodonts and their kin, predators with increasingly mammal-like bodies and dentition. Inostrancevia, the largest of the gorgonopsids, was a formidable predator the size of a large lion, with massive saber-like canine teeth. On the sauropsid side of the amniot family tree, the archosaur lineage was beginning to emerge, the group that would eventually give rise to the dinosaurs, the crocodilians, and the birds. But in the Permian, the synapsids dominated the land. The sauropsids were present but less prominent, more diverse in body form but less ecologically dominant. The world of the Permian lasted for 50 million years. It saw the development of complex terrestrial ecosystems, elaborate plant communities, diverse vertebrate faunas. By the late Permian, some of the most sophisticated large land animals that had yet evolved were living and hunting and feeding and reproducing across the face of Pangaea. And then something happened that shattered it all. The Permian Triassic mass extinction, known informally as the Great Dying, occurred approximately 252 million years ago. It is the most severe mass extinction in the history of life on Earth. In the ocean, it is estimated that 90 to 96% of all marine species went extinct. On land, approximately 70% of vertebrate species were lost. To put that in perspective, of every 100 species alive in the ocean at the end of the Permian, only 4 to 10 survived into the Triassic. The reefs that had existed in various forms since the Silurian were completely destroyed. The ocean would be without significant coral reefs for millions of years. The diversity of marine invertebrates, the brachiopods, the crinoids, the trilobites, was devastated. The trilobites, which had survived 3 previous mass extinctions and persisted for nearly 300 million years, were wiped out completely. They were gone, forever. On land, the great herbivore communities of the Permian collapsed. The lush forests and diverse savannas of the Permian were reduced to something approaching a wasteland. The cause of the Great Dying was volcanic activity on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. In what is now Siberia, a region of volcanic activity called the Siberian Traps, erupted in pulses over perhaps 1 million years, releasing basaltic lava that covered an area roughly equal to modern Europe. But the lava itself was not the primary killer. The volcanism injected enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide caused rapid global warming. Temperatures rose by perhaps 10 or even 15 degrees Celsius on a global average, and much more in the tropics. The sulfur dioxide caused acid rain. The warming caused ocean circulation to slow, leading to anoxia, the loss of dissolved oxygen, in deep and eventually shallow waters. The warmer oceans could hold less oxygen anyway. Marine life was asphyxiating in warm, acidified, oxygen-poor water. The warming may also have caused the destabilization of methane clathrates on the seafloor. Frozen compounds that contain enormous quantities of methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide. If those clathrates melted and released their methane into the atmosphere, the warming would have accelerated catastrophically. The end Permian was not a quick death. It played out over perhaps 60,000 years, a geological moment, but an eternity in biological terms. 60,000 years of deteriorating conditions, rising temperatures, acidifying oceans, dying ecosystems. When it was over, the world was almost empty. Almost, not completely. There were survivors. There are always survivors. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, a handful of lineages, those that had been able to tolerate the extreme conditions, or those that had been in the right place, or those that had simply been lucky, emerged into a largely empty world. Among the survivors were the cynodonts, advanced synapsid therapsids that were among the most mammal-like animals yet to have existed. They survived, perhaps because of physiological tolerances or behavioral flexibility or dietary adaptability. They would be the ancestors of the first true mammals. And among the survivors were the archosaurs, those early members of the lineage that would give rise to crocodilians and birds, and first and most spectacularly, the dinosaurs. The world of the Triassic was waiting for them, empty, devastated, utterly changed, but full of opportunity. Let the weight of those numbers settle gently around you as you rest. 96% of ocean species gone, the trilobites 300 million years old extinguished forever, the magnificent Permian world vanished. And yet from that ruin, from those few survivors clinging to life in a devastated world, everything that comes next would grow. The dinosaurs, the mammals, ultimately us. The story was not over. It was, in a very real sense, just beginning. There is something profoundly comforting about deep time when you let yourself sink into it. The daily concerns of a human life, the anxieties, the deadlines, the small irritations and larger worries, are real and valid. They matter. But when you hold them up against the 4.5 billion years of this planet's history, against the unimaginable patience of geological time, something shifts. The urgent becomes less urgent. The important remains important, but sits in a larger context. The Earth has survived 5 mass extinctions. It has been a frozen ball of ice and a molten ocean of rock. It has had an atmosphere of methane and an atmosphere of oxygen and every composition in between. It has been struck by asteroids and drowned in volcanic floods and been stripped almost clean of life. And every time life found a way. Every time something survived. Every time the next chapter was written. You are reading the latest chapter. You are, in a very real sense, the latest chapter. The current expression of 4 billion years of biological creativity. The product of an unbroken chain of survival and reproduction, stretching back to those first cells in the warm Archean Ocean. That chain has never been broken, not once. In 4 billion years, the line of descent that leads to you has never failed to include at least one organism that survived, reproduced, and passed its genetic material on to the next generation. Every extinction, every catastrophe, every ice age and volcanic winter and asteroid impact, your line of ancestry came through all of it. You are the product of 4 billion years of survival. The oldest thing about you is not your body, which is young, or your memories, which are recent. The oldest thing about you is the fact of your existence, the unbroken continuity of life that stretches from the first cell to you. Let that settle into your bones as you rest. Let it soften the edges of whatever tension you carry. You're not new, you're not fragile, you're the latest expression of something 4 billion years old, something that has survived everything this planet could throw at it. Deep time is not a cold or empty concept. It is, if you let it be, an extraordinarily comforting one. And so we return to the story, carrying that comfort with us, and we watch the ancient world continue to unfold. The continental movements of the Permian and Triassic were not merely background events. They shaped the world in ways that directly affected the evolution of life. As Pangaea assembled during the Carboniferous and Permian, the interior of the supercontinent became increasingly isolated from oceanic moisture. Vast deserts formed in the continental interior, red-coloured sandstones preserved in rocks found today, across much of Europe and North America, record the existence of these ancient deserts in vivid detail. The red colour is significant. It is iron oxide, rust, formed by the oxidation of iron in the sediments by the increasingly oxygen-rich atmosphere. Before the Great Oxidation event, ancient sediments were often grey or greenish because iron remained in its unoxidized ferrous form. After the atmosphere became oxygen-rich, iron in exposed sediments was oxidized to the ferric form and sedimentary rocks turned red. The red sandstones of the Permian and Triassic are, in a sense, a record written in rust, a record of an oxygenated world, a world that owed its breathable air to those ancient cyanobacteria working away in the Archean Ocean. The breakup of Pangaea, which began in the Triassic and continued through the Jurassic and Cretaceous, reversed the process of supercontinent assembly. As the landmasses separated, new ocean basins opened between them, moderating the continental climate and allowing more moisture to penetrate inland. Forests spread, diversity increased. The opening of new seaways allowed ocean circulation to change, altering the distribution of heat around the globe and influencing climate in ways that are still the subject of active research. The Tethys Sea, the ocean that separated the northern landmasses of Laurasia from the southern landmasses of Gondwana as Pangaea broke up, was a warm, shallow tropical sea that supported extraordinary marine biodiversity throughout the Mesozoic. Its sediments, now uplifted into mountain ranges across Europe and Asia, including the Alps and the Himalayas and the ranges of the Middle East, contain the fossils of the creatures that once swam in its warm ancient waters. The breakup of Gondwana, the southern supercontinent, distributed the southern continents across a wide range of latitudes, leading to the isolation and independent evolution of the faunas on each fragment. The distinctive animals of Australia and South America, the marsupials, the unique plants and insects, are in part the product of this ancient separation, the legacy of the breakup of a supercontinent that happened when dinosaurs still walked the earth. Every continent you know is a fragment of something older. Every ocean is the scar of a separation. The mountain ranges are the crumple zones of ancient collisions. The plains are the flaws of vanished seas. The world you inhabit is not static. It is a moment in an ongoing process, a snapshot of a planet in constant, slow, geological motion. And that motion, over billions of years, has been one of the great engines of biological diversity, creating new habitats, separating populations, driving evolution in 1,000 different directions at once. The oceans of the ancient world also deserve more attention, because for most of Earth's history, for the vast majority of the 4 billion years of life, the ocean was where life lived. The land was not colonized until the Silurian and Devonian, and even after that, the ocean remained the richer and more diverse environment for hundreds of millions of years. The diversity of the modern ocean still surpasses that of the land in terms of the number of major animal body plans, phyla, represented. Every major animal phylum except the insects is found in the ocean. The ocean is not merely a background feature of the Earth's history, it is the primary theatre of life. The ancient oceans had chemical compositions very different from the modern. The Archean Ocean was warm, iron-rich and oxygen-free. The Proterozoic Ocean was more complex, oxygenated in shallow zones, still anoxic at depth, with patchy iron and sulfur chemistry. The Paleozoic Ocean was more similar to the modern, but with different balances of calcium and magnesium carbonate that influenced the ability of organisms to build shells and skeletons. The temperature of the ocean has varied enormously over geological time, from perhaps near freezing during the Snowball Earth episodes to the warm, equitable temperatures of the Mesozoic, when there were no permanent polar ice caps, and the difference in temperature between the equator and the poles was far less than today. These temperature variations had profound effects on ocean circulation, which drives the mixing of nutrients and oxygen through the water column, and on the biology of marine organisms which are exquisitely sensitive to temperature. The chemistry of the atmosphere and ocean is coupled. Carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, forming carbonic acid, and this coupling links the carbon cycle of the land with the chemistry of the sea. When volcanic activity increases, more carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere and dissolves in the ocean, warming the climate and acidifying the sea. When weathering increases, as happens when mountains are uplifted and exposed to rain, carbon dioxide is drawn from the atmosphere, cooling the climate. Over geological timescales, these feedbacks have maintained the climate within the range that allows liquid water at the surface. Never too hot, never too cold, always within the Goldilocks zone that life requires. This climate regulation is not guaranteed, and it has not always worked perfectly. The Snowball Earth episodes show that the system can tip into extreme states. But over billions of years, the overall tendency has been toward a stable, habitable planet, and that stability, imperfect and intermittent as it has sometimes been, has been the foundation on which the entire edifice of life has been built. The wonder of it is not that life has sometimes struggled. The wonder is that it has always persisted. In the cold after the Great Dying, in the dark after a major impact, in the drought of the Permian deserts and the glacial cold of the Snowball Earth, in all of these extremes life found its way, not because life is tough in some simple mechanical sense. Many individual organisms were fragile, many species easily extinguished, but because life, in aggregate, is resilient in a way that no individual organism is. The diversity of life, the enormous variety of different body plans and metabolic strategies and ecological roles, ensures that when any one type of environment disappears, some other type of organism, adapted to some other type of environment, is waiting in the wings. The diversity of life is life's insurance policy against catastrophe. And the extraordinary diversity of the world today, the millions of species, the thousands of ecosystems, the astonishing variety of life's forms and functions, is the product of 4 billion years of building that insurance policy, adding new strategies and new forms and new possibilities, generation by generation, extinction by extinction, recovery by recovery. You are part of that insurance policy. Every living thing is. Let that knowledge carry you gently into rest. The therapsids of the Permian are often overlooked in popular accounts of prehistoric life, which tend to leap from the Carboniferous amphibians directly to the dinosaurs. But the therapsids were remarkable animals, and their story spans much of the Permian and Triassic, 50 million years or more of evolution and diversification, interrupted by the greatest catastrophe in the history of animal life. The word therapsid comes from the Greek for arched opening, referring to the configuration of the opening in the skull behind the eye, a single large opening that allowed the attachment of larger, more powerful jaw muscles than the earlier amniotes had possessed. This seemingly minor anatomical feature had profound consequences. Better jaw muscles meant a more powerful bite, which meant a wider range of possible foods, which drove the diversification of feeding strategies that characterizes the therapsids. The earliest therapsids, appearing in the Middle Permian perhaps 270 million years ago, were the anomodonts, a diverse group that included the dicynodonts already mentioned, as well as various other herbivorous and omnivorous forms. They replaced the pelycosaurs, the earlier synapsids, the fin-backed creatures like Dimetrodon, as the dominant large animals on land. The most dramatic therapsids were the gorgonopsids, large, powerful carnivores that were the apex predators of the late Permian ecosystem. Gorgonopsids ranged in size from small fox-sized animals to the enormous Inostrancevia, which could exceed 3 meters in length. Their skulls were long and narrow, with large, curved canine teeth that projected well below the lower jaw, a saber-toothed design that appeared multiple times in the history of large predators, a testament to its effectiveness. The Gorgonopsids were also, in their overall body form, surprisingly mammal-like. Their legs were held more directly beneath their bodies than those of the earlier pelycosaurs, giving them a more upright mammal-like posture. Their vertebral column showed features suggesting a more flexible back that could bend from side to side like a mammal's rather than undulating from side to side like a lizard's. They may have had metabolic rates higher than modern reptiles, not quite warm-blooded in the full mammalian sense but moving in that direction. Alongside the gorgonopsids in the late Permian ecosystem were the cynodonts, smaller, more advanced therapsids that would eventually give rise to the true mammals. Even in the late Permian, the cynodonts showed features that were strikingly mammal-like. Enlarged dentary bones in the lower jaw, differentiated teeth with multiple cusps for processing food, and skull features suggesting the presence of facial muscles and perhaps whiskers. Some cynodonts may have been fully warm-blooded. Some may have had fur. The Permian world supported these complex, sophisticated animals in a landscape that, while alien in its geography, would have been recognizable in some of its features. The equatorial regions of Pangaea were warm, with forests of conifers and seed ferns. The higher latitudes were cooler and drier, perhaps with more open, grassland-like environments, though without true grass, which would not evolve until much later. The South Polar region of Pangaea, what is now Antarctica, Southern Africa, South America, India and Australia, then joined as the southern landmass called Gondwana, was cold enough for glaciers at times. The glaciations of the late Carboniferous and early Permian were significant enough to leave traces in the rocks of Gondwana. Glacial deposits, scratched and polished rock surfaces, the debris left by ancient ice sheets. By the mid-Permian, the glaciations had largely ended as the assembly of Pangaea changed the patterns of ocean circulation and heat transport around the globe. The climate warmed and dried. The diversity of the Permian fauna expanded. And then, in the last few million years of the Permian, the world began to deteriorate. The Siberian traps, the enormous volcanic event that would cause the end Permian extinction, did not begin suddenly. There were pulses of volcanism in the lead-up to the main event, each pulse injecting carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere and perturbing the climate. The world warmed in steps. The ocean chemistry began to shift. The reefs of the late Permian were already under stress before the main extinction event struck. The main phase of the Siberian Traps volcanism involved the eruption of perhaps 3 to 4 million cubic kilometers of basaltic lava over a period estimated at between 1 and 2 million years, a rate of volcanic activity roughly equivalent to all of the Earth's current volcanic output concentrated into one region. But the lava itself was not the primary mechanism of extinction. The gases were. Sulfur dioxide from the eruptions dissolved in rain to form sulfuric acid rain that would have damaged plant communities across wide areas, disrupting the food base of terrestrial ecosystems. Carbon dioxide caused warming, but the warming also caused the release of methane from permafrost and from seafloor clathrates, and methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas. The ocean absorbed carbon dioxide and became more acidic, disrupting the ability of marine organisms to form calcium carbonate shells and skeletons, a process called ocean acidification that affected virtually every organism in the marine ecosystem. The ocean also became anoxic, stripped of dissolved oxygen by the combined effects of warming, which reduces oxygen solubility, and increased nutrient input from land, which fueled algal blooms, the decay of which consumed oxygen. The dead zones of the modern ocean, where oxygen levels are too low to support most animal life, are a small shadow of the global anoxia that affected much of the Permian Ocean during the extinction. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what these numbers mean for the actual animals living through them. A world that warms by 10 or 15 degrees does not simply become warmer and otherwise the same. The food webs unravel, the plants die or relocate, and the herbivores that depended on them either follow or starve. The predators that depended on the herbivores follow or starve in turn. The ocean's reefs collapse, and the millions of species that depended on them as habitat go with them. The freshwater chemistry changes, and the fish in the rivers and lakes suffocate or are poisoned. It is not a dramatic moment. It is a slow, grinding deterioration over thousands of years, longer than the entire span of recorded human history. Animals being born into a world slightly worse than the one their parents lived in. Animals dying a little younger, reproducing a little less successfully, populations declining generation by generation until there are too few individuals to maintain genetic diversity or to find mates. And then silence. The silence of the early Triassic, after the Great Dying, was unlike anything the Earth had experienced since the earliest Archean. The complex, rich world of the Permian, the therapsid-dominated savanna, the diverse marine communities, the forests, was reduced to a handful of survivors in an otherwise empty world. But those survivors carried within them the genetic raw material for everything that came next. The cynodonts, small and adaptable and warm-blooded enough to survive the thermal stress of the event, were the key survivors on land. The archosaurs, ancestors of the dinosaurs, were also among the survivors, perhaps because of their more flexible metabolic strategies or their ability to exploit the scrubby, impoverished vegetation of the early Triassic. The Triassic recovery was uneven. The ocean recovered more slowly than the land, perhaps because the marine systems were more severely disrupted. On land, the early Triassic was dominated by disaster fauna, the ecological equivalent of weeds, generalist species that could exploit disturbed environments. Lystrosaurus, a medium-sized cynodont therapsid, was extraordinarily abundant in the early Triassic, found on virtually every continent in rocks of this age. It was the cockroach of the early Triassic, unglamorous, tough, versatile everywhere. As the Triassic progressed, the fauna diversified. New herbivores evolved. New predators followed the herbivores. The archosaurs, which had been relatively minor components of the late Permian ecosystem, seized the opportunities offered by the devastated Triassic world and began to diversify rapidly. The first pterosaurs appeared in the Triassic. Flying reptiles with wings formed by a membrane stretched from an enormously elongated fourth finger. They were the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight, predating the birds by more than 50 million years. The first marine reptiles, plesiosaurs, nothosaurs and others, diversified in the Triassic Ocean, filling the ecological roles vacated by the marine reptiles that had gone extinct in the Great Dying. And the first dinosaurs, small and unassuming, walked out of the early archosaur radiation into a world that, by the end of the Triassic, was ready to be inherited. All of this, every chapter of this story, every eon of patience, every catastrophe and recovery, was the preparation for what came next. The dinosaurs were not the beginning. They were an act in the middle of a very long play. But they were, by the standards of vertebrate life, a spectacularly successful act. 165 million years of ruling the land, diversifying into forms of extraordinary variety and achievement before the curtain fell on them too. And we, the mammals, who had been the small nocturnal burrowing animals of the dinosaur world, emerged into the ecological space left by the extinction and began our own extraordinary diversification. 66 million years later, here we are. One small branch of one lineage, of one class, of one phylum, of one kingdom of life, sitting in the dark, listening to a story about our ancient ancestors. It is a good story, and it is all true. So rest now, traveller. Let the deep time surround you like water, warm and gentle and ancient. Let the billions of years settle over you. Let the story continue in your sleep. The ongoing story of a universe learning to know itself, of a planet finding its way through fire and ice and time, of life persisting through everything, arriving always, improbably and wonderfully at the present moment. The ancient ocean is still in you. The Cambrian sea still moves in your blood. The Carboniferous sky still breathes in your lungs. The Permian therapsids still warm your body from within. You are ancient. You are continuous. You are the latest chapter of the oldest story. Sleep well. And so, dear traveller, we reach the end of our journey through deep time. We have crossed 4.5 billion years together. We have witnessed the birth of a planet from fire and debris. We have watched the first oceans form, the first cells come alive, the first oxygen rise through an ancient sky. We have seen the Ediacaran garden spread across the seafloor, the Cambrian explosion ignite the ocean with complexity, the first trees rise toward a sky tinted with unusual light. We have seen the coal swamps and the giant insects, the therapsids walking upright across Pangaea, and the long, terrible silence of the world after the Great Dying. And we have seen the survivors, always the survivors, clinging on, adapting, waiting for their moment. The dinosaurs are coming, but that is a story for another night. For now, let this deep history settle over you like sediment drifting to the floor of an ancient sea. Slow, gentle, layer by layer. There is nothing you need to hold on to, nothing you need to remember. The story will be here when you return to it. Your breathing is slow and easy, your body is heavy and warm, You're safe and the world is ancient and beautiful, and you are part of it, connected by an unbroken chain of life all the way back to those first, invisible cells in the warm Archean water. Let yourself drift down into sleep the way sediment drifts down through still water. Down slowly into the quiet. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Sleep well, traveller. The deep past will keep its watch through the night.